Marry me by Saturday, or lose everything your father built. Those are the only choices you have left, Josephine." Josie Langford looked Silas Vane straight in the eye in front of his own men in the yard her father had bled for, and she said no. She said it without flinching, without hesitation, without a single word wasted. She had 5 days, a forged will, 2 dead witnesses, and no lawyer. What she did not have was a husband until a stranger rode through her open gate. That same afternoon, on an exhausted horse, looked at the court order crushed in her fist and said, "Then it's fortunate I rode through your gate on Monday." If this story moved you, subscribe and follow until the very last word. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The messenger's horse was already halfway back down the road when Josie finally looked up from the paper. Around her 3 ranch hands worked the corral, Buster Walsh pushing calves toward the chute, old Pete Garland working the rope, and young Danny Reyes keeping the fire going beneath the irons. None of them had seen the order. She was grateful for that. She wasn't ready to explain what she hadn't yet understood. She folded the paper once then again and pushed it into her shirt pocket. The iron needed reheating. There were 14 more calves waiting. She would finish the branding, eat something before noon, and then ride into Mesa Verde and find out exactly who thought they could put Sunridge Ranch in a court document without her knowing about it. It was Monday. That meant she had 5 days. She went back to work. But the numbers wouldn't leave her alone. Her father, Hector Langford, had been dead for 4 months. She had managed his final weeks. The medicines, the ledgers, the land taxes, the 100 small decisions a sick man could no longer make. He had trusted her. He had told her more than once that Sunridge would be hers, that she was the only one who understood what it cost to keep it alive. He had said those things with a clear mind, looking directly into her eyes. He had never said anything about marriage. She turned the iron in the fire and watched the coals breathe. Somewhere behind her, Pete cleared his throat. "You all right, Miss Josie?" "Fine," she said. "Keep working." By 10 o'clock, the branding was done, and the calves were turned back into the pasture. Josie washed her hands at the pump, dried them on her work trousers, and went to find her aunt. Martha Langford was in the kitchen garden cutting back the overgrown rosemary with a pair of heavy shears. She was 56 years old, not tall, and she moved with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had outlasted most of the things that had frightened her in her youth. She looked at Josie's face and set the shears down without being asked. "Sit," she said. Josie didn't sit. She pulled the paper from her pocket and handed it over. "Martha, read it." She read it again. She folded it carefully and held it between both hands for a moment before she looked up. "Silas Vane," she said. "His name isn't on it, but it's his handwriting on the debt attached to the estate. I recognize it from the invoices he sent last winter. This says your father's will. Papa would not have written that clause." Josie's voice was flat and certain. "He spent 12 years making sure this ranch would survive without a man running it. He trained me. He put my name on every document he legally could. He did not sit in his sickbed and decide that everything he built would pass to a land creditor if I failed to find a husband in 5 days." Martha placed the paper on the garden bench and smoothed it with one hand. "Where is the original will? That's the problem. The county recorder says there's only one copy on file, this one. The lawyer who drew up Papa's final papers was Arnold Whitfield. He died in February." "Convenient. That's what I thought." Josie sat down at last, not because she needed rest, but because she needed to think with both feet on the ground. The marriage clause was witnessed by a clerk named Elias Drummond. Drummond died in December, 6 weeks before Whitfield. 2 dead men, both of whose names are on a document that gives Silas Vane my ranch. Martha said nothing for a moment. A bird moved through the rosemary and flew off. "Does Silas know you've seen this?" "The messenger works for the county office. Silas appointed 2 of the 3 county commissioners last year. He knows." "Then he'll come here." "He'll come today," Josie said, "before I have time to find a lawyer." She was right. Silas Vane arrived at Sunridge Ranch before 2 o'clock that afternoon. He rode in with 2 men behind him. Not the rough hired muscle, Some wealthy men used but sharply dressed writers, who had the careful, observant look of men paid to notice things and report them accurately. Silas himself was 51, broad across the shoulders, with silver hair kept short beneath a good hat. He was not an ugly man, and he understood that. He dressed well, spoke carefully, and had the manner of someone who expected to be taken seriously without having to demand it. Josie met him in the yard before he reached the porch. She did not offer him water. She did not invite him inside. "Mr. Vane," she said. "Miss Langford." He looked at the buildings around them, the house, the barn, the equipment shed, the new fencing along the east pasture that Josie had paid for herself last fall. His look was not predatory. That was what made it worse. It was the look of a man taking inventory of what already belonged to him. "I imagine you've had a difficult morning. I've had an informative one." "Then you've read the court order?" "I have." She kept her hands loose at her sides. "I'd like to discuss the original will." Silas tilted his head in a way that might have been sympathy. "The original, I'm afraid, can't be located. The county office has made a thorough search. What's on record is what we have to work with." Arnold Whitfield kept copies of everything he drafted, his office records. His estate was settled by his brother in February. Any remaining files were either transferred to the county archive or disposed of according to his instructions. He paused. "I understand this is very difficult. Your father was a good man. I had enormous respect for him." "Then show that respect by explaining why his will now contains a clause neither I nor Martha has ever heard mentioned." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not guilt. She didn't think Silas Vane felt guilt the way ordinary people did. It was more like the small adjustment a chess player makes when an opponent makes a better move than expected. "The clause was Hector's decision," he said. "I believe he was concerned about your future. He wanted Sunridge to have stability." Stability. She let the words sit between them. "My father built this ranch from raw land and a borrowed mule. He raised me to read contracts, manage payroll, negotiate cattle prices, and identify a dishonest invoice at 20 yards. If he was concerned about stability, he would have added capital to the estate, not a marriage requirement." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the particular confidence of a man who believes all negotiations eventually end in his favor. "I'm not your enemy, Josephine." She had told him twice at separate occasions over the previous year that she preferred to be called Josie. He kept using the full name. She had stopped correcting him. "I've come to offer you a fair arrangement," he continued. "If you agree to marry me by Saturday, Sunridge remains intact. You would live here. You would continue managing daily operations. Nothing would change about your life except your legal status and your financial security, which would be considerably improved." Josie looked at him for a long moment. Around them the ranch was quiet. Buster had taken the horses to the south paddock after the branding. Pete and Danny were somewhere near the equipment shed. She could hear a hawk somewhere above the east ridge. The afternoon sun was hard and flat and honest, the way New Mexico sun always was. "I'd like you to leave," she said. Silas didn't move. "The court order is not, in my view, a legitimate document. I intend to prove that, and I intend to do it before Saturday. But even if I couldn't..." She took a breath and kept her voice steady. "Even if that document were entirely legitimate, and I had no recourse and no time, my answer would still be no. A man who acquires a woman through a forged will is not a husband. He's a creditor with a marriage certificate. And I did not manage this ranch through 2 droughts, a cattle epidemic, and my father's dying months so that I could hand it to a creditor." The silence between them was very complete. Then Silas straightened his hat, turned toward his horse, and spoke without looking back. "You have until noon on Saturday, Miss Langford. After that, the court will enforce the transfer. I'll see to it personally." He rode out the same way he'd come in. Josie stood in the yard until his dust settled. Then she turned around and found Martha standing on the porch with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable, which was how Martha looked when she was working out something serious. Well, Martha said. "Yes," Josie agreed. She had 4.5 days. No lawyer. She trusted a county judge who was currently 3 counties away at a land conference and a document signed by 2 dead men. She went back inside and started going through her father's papers again. She was still at the desk 2 hours later, working through a box of old invoices and correspondence she hadn't opened since the funeral, when the sound came from the corral. Not a crash exactly, but the deep concussive lurch of something large and panicked, hitting a wooden structure with everything it had. Josie was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move. She came through the back door at a run and saw exactly what she'd feared: the big red bull, the one her father had called Senator, because of his opinions about fences, had put his shoulder through the east panel of the corral and was now half in half out, tangled in the broken boards and furious about it. Senator was 1,200 pounds of bad temper on a good day. Tangled in fence lumber with 3 frightened ranch hands yelling at him from what they hoped was a safe distance, he was considerably worse. "Don't crowd him," Josie called. "Back up, Buster, get back." And then she saw the stranger. He had come through the open ranch gate on a horse that was clearly exhausted, lathered head, drooping, moving on discipline rather than energy. The man riding it was tall, with dark brown hair, and the kind of build that spoke to years of physical work rather than any deliberate effort to be impressive. He took in the situation in about 2 seconds, swung down from his horse without hurrying, handed his reins to Danny Reyes, who had moved toward him automatically, and walked straight toward the bull. "Back up," he said to Josie, not rudely, but with the calm certainty of someone who had handled panicked livestock before and understood the geometry of the problem. "Give him a line." Josie backed up, not because she was told to, but because she recognized that he was right. The stranger moved to the bull's left, giving the animal a clear exit path on the right. He made no sudden movements. He said nothing. He simply stood in the right position and waited. Senator lurched sideways, dragged one hoof free from the lumber, and found his footing. He stared at the stranger with the hot, offended dignity of an animal who has embarrassed himself and blames everyone else for witnessing it. Then he moved through the break in the fence at a deliberate walk, as though the entire incident had been everyone else's fault, and headed toward the water trough. The stranger watched him go. Then he turned to look at the fence damage. "You've got 3 panels down and 2 more that won't last another week," he said. "The post on the far end is rotted through." Josie looked at him. "I know." He looked at her then. His eyes were an odd hazel, more green than brown in the afternoon light, and there was something in his face that she couldn't immediately classify. He was handsome, which she noticed the way she noticed weather as information not necessarily welcome. "Rhett Calloway," he said. "I'm looking for water for my horse and 1 night's work if you have it." "You're a long way from any trail." "I took a detour." Something in the flatness of that answer suggested the detour had not been voluntary. Josie was about to ask him to state his business more clearly, when she noticed his eyes drop to her shirt pocket, to the corner of the paper she'd been carrying all day. The paper she'd forgotten was still there. "You've got something in your hand," he said. She looked down. She had pulled the court order from her pocket without realizing it, the way you reach for something worrying without meaning to. She almost put it away. Then she didn't. She didn't know why she showed it to him. Perhaps because she'd spent 2 hours alone with it and needed the reality check of another person's eyes. Perhaps because he'd just solved her bull problem with a quiet competence that suggested he was something other than what his exhausted horse indicated. Perhaps because she was tired and cornered, and the instinct to trust someone, anyone, was fighting hard against the instinct that had kept her safe for 27 years. She held the paper out. He read it. His face didn't change much, but she watched his eyes, and she could see him working through it. Not skimming, but actually reading, processing the legal language with the attention of someone who had dealt with documents before. "Marriage clause," he said. "By noon Saturday." "Yes." "And the man named as creditor?" "Silas Vane. He was here 2 hours ago to offer me a solution." Rhett folded the paper and held it back out to her. "What kind of solution?" "The marrying him kind." He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the hands had gone back to work. Buster and Pete working on the broken fence panels, Danny leading Rhett's horse to the water. The afternoon was moving. The sun was dropping toward the western ridgeline. Josie was aware of every minute. "Looks like you need more than a fence repaired," Rhett said. "I need a husband by Saturday." She hadn't meant to say it like that. She hadn't meant to say it at all, not to a stranger, not so flatly. But it was out, and it was true, and she didn't have time for careful phrasing. Rhett Calloway removed his hat. He studied her with an expression she couldn't read. Not amusement, not calculation, not the particular look men sometimes got when they sensed a vulnerable woman and started considering their options. It was something more like seriousness. The kind of seriousness that costs something to maintain. "Then it's fortunate I rode through your gate on Monday," he said. Josie stared at him. She had been managing her father's ranch for 4 years. She had fired a dishonest foreman, renegotiated 3 unfavorable contracts, survived a livestock fever that killed half the valley's cattle, and held her composure through her father's slow decline, without breaking in front of anyone who reported to her. She had done all of that, and believed herself to be a woman who was not easily caught off guard. She could not find a single word. Rhett put his hat back on. "Water my horse," he said, "and I'll fix your fence before dark. Then we can talk about the rest." Martha brought coffee. This was Martha's way of communicating that she considered a situation serious enough to require everyone to sit down and hold something warm. They sat at the kitchen table, Josie, Martha, and the stranger, who had appeared at the worst possible moment, and offered with the calm of a man recommending fence lumber to marry her. Rhett held the mug with both hands and did not drink it immediately, which Josie took as a sign that he was accustomed to coffee that needed to cool before it was safe. "Tell me why you're willing to do this," she said. "I need work. I need my name associated with something solid while I clear up some legal trouble of my own." He paused. "And I'll say plainly, what Silas Vane is doing to you is wrong. A man who uses a dead man's paperwork to force a woman into marriage is not a businessman. He's something worse. That's a principle, not a reason. Sometimes a principle is the reason." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking for your ranch, Miss Langford. I'm not asking for your cattle or your land or anything in this house. I'm offering to be legally married to you, long enough to defeat a fraudulent claim, after which we make whatever arrangement suits both of us. Annulment separation, or whatever the territory allows. I'll accept wages for ranch work. If we solve the problem, and you want me gone, I go. If there's a legal instrument that clears it up faster, we find it." Martha spoke for the first time since she'd set down the coffee. "What's the legal trouble you mentioned?" Rhett turned to look at her with what appeared to be respect for the directness of the question. 3 years ago, I was the trail foreman on a cattle drive out of Tucson, 200 head, belonging to a rancher named Alton McCready. During a river crossing outside of Rosario, the crossing ropes failed. We lost 140 cattle to the current. I was blamed. "Were you responsible?" Martha asked. "No." The word was short and undecorated. "But you couldn't prove that." "I couldn't prove it then. I've been working my way back through the route since last fall, trying to find anyone who was there and saw what actually happened." He set down his coffee. "The accusation follows me. There are places I can't work because Alton McCready's name travels faster than I do. I need an established position somewhere long enough to build a record that contradicts the story that's been told about me." The kitchen was quiet. Josie looked at the grain of the table and did the arithmetic she always did, not just the obvious numbers, but the ones underneath. "What would you need from this arrangement?" she asked. "A bed in the bunkhouse while it lasts. Fair wages. The chance to show what I can actually do." He paused. "And honesty. If we're going to do this, I won't pretend when we're alone. I won't perform a marriage. I'll tell you the truth, and I expect the same." "You may not always like what I tell you," Josie said. "I don't need to like it. I need it to be true." Martha made a small sound that might have been approval. Josie was not ready to say yes. She was not sure she ever would be ready to say yes to something this large and this risky and this dependent on a stranger's character she had no time to properly evaluate. But she was running out of alternatives, and she was smart enough to know it. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me." "The ranch stays in my name. Not yours, not ours, mine. Any legal document we sign before this wedding makes that clear in language that cannot be misread." He nodded. "Agreed." "You receive no ownership of any part of Sunridge without my written consent. Not the land, not the cattle, not the buildings, not the water rights." "Agreed." "If either of us wishes to end this arrangement once the dispute is resolved, the other makes no legal or personal impediment." "Agreed." He met her eyes without flinching. "And I have one condition of my own. What I said before, no pretending when we're alone. Whatever this is, we tell each other the truth. Not polished truth, the actual thing." She thought about it. It was the condition she had least expected, and perhaps because of that, the one that made her trust him slightly more than she had before he said it. "All right," she said. Martha refilled both cups without being asked. The next morning, Josie set Rhett Calloway to work. She was not gentle about it. She gave him the corral repair first, not because it was the most important task, but because she needed to see how he worked when he thought he was being observed and compare it to how he worked when he thought she wasn't looking. She watched from the equipment shed, measuring hinge pins and pretending to take inventory, and what she saw was a man who did not slow down or speed up based on who might be watching. He pulled the rotted posts properly, set the new ones to depth, and braced the panels with a diagonal cross brace that was better than what she'd had before. When he came in for the midday meal, he reported what he'd done in 3 sentences and asked where the spare lumber was kept, because he'd noticed the trough in the north paddock had a seam that was starting to separate. "I'll show you after you eat," she said. "At the trough." He stopped before she could point out the problem and crouched down to look at something else. A discoloration in the wood along the water line, and beneath it in the mud at the base of the structure, a smell she had not noticed before. "Something was poured in here," he said. Josie crouched beside him. She smelled it too now that she was looking something chemical beneath the muddy water smell, faint but deliberate. "When did your cattle last drink from this trough?" "Yesterday morning. 2 of them were off their feed at the evening check." Her voice had gone flat and focused. "I thought it was the heat." She went immediately to the north pasture. The 2 cattle she'd noticed were standing apart from the herd, and now that she was looking at them properly, she recognized the signs she'd misread as heat stress. The slight tremor in the hindquarters, the unfocused eyes, the reluctance to move. She knew what plant could cause these symptoms if something concentrated from it was introduced into drinking water. She'd seen it once before years ago when a neighbor's creek ran through a stand of jimsonweed after a flood. She told Rhett what to do. Move the affected animals to the barn. Flush the trough, completely get fresh water in from the well. And she went to get what she needed from the kitchen to treat the sick cattle. Not because she was dismissing him from the problem, but because she was the one who knew exactly what was in her stores and exactly what dose to use. When she came back, both cattle were already in the barn, and Rhett had the trough draining. "How'd you know to move them without waiting for me to say so?" she asked. "You told me where you were going and why. The next step was obvious." He looked at her. "I don't need instructions for things that are obvious." She treated the cattle. Both of them would recover. She was nearly certain someone had done this deliberately. "Can you tell who?" Rhett asked when she said it aloud. "Not yet, but jimsonweed concentrate takes preparation. This wasn't opportunistic." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Silas Vane has been in this county long enough to know your land. He'd know which trough your north cattle use." "Yes." She straightened up and looked at the sick animals. "He was here yesterday. He could have given instructions before he came. Or one of your hands." She didn't want to believe that. She'd known Buster Walsh for 6 years. Pete Garland had worked for her father before her. Danny Reyes was barely 20 and needed the work too badly to risk it. But she'd been wrong about people before. The afternoon wore on, and Josie found herself working beside Rhett in a rhythm she hadn't expected. He didn't offer opinions she hadn't asked for. He didn't explain things to her as if she needed information that she clearly already possessed. When she made a decision, he carried it out without renegotiating. When he saw something she'd missed, a ground squirrel hole near the barn foundation, a loose wheel on the supply wagon, he pointed it out and asked where she kept the materials to fix it. That evening after supper, Pete Garland appeared at the kitchen door and asked to speak to Josie alone. She stepped out to the porch. Rhett, who had been at the table reviewing the freight invoice she'd been puzzling over, stayed inside without being asked. Pete was 62 years old and had the careful face of a man who chose his words like someone spending the last of his savings. He had worked for the Langford family for 11 years. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about Amos Reed." Josie waited. "Amos is in Mesa Verde. He came through 2 days ago. He's been working a ranch out near the eastern boundary, but he's getting old, and they let him go. He's staying at the Ramsey Hotel." Pete paused. Amos was on the Callaway Drive, the one where the cattle were lost. Josie was very still. "What drive?" 3 years back. The Tucson to Rosario Drive that everyone said Rhett Callaway ruined. Pete looked at the ground, then back at her. "Amos has talked about it. Not much. He doesn't talk about much, but when he does, he doesn't tell the same story that got told in court." After Pete went back to the bunkhouse, Josie stood on the porch for a moment in the cooling dark. Through the kitchen window, she could see the lamp burning and the shape of Rhett Callaway bent over her father's papers reading. She went back inside. "I need to ride into Mesa Verde tomorrow," she said. "There's a man there I need to speak with. His name is Amos Reed." Rhett looked up. His face was difficult to read in the lamplight. She watched something cross it that she couldn't name, not quite surprise and not quite hope, but something between the two that was careful about being either. "You know that name," she said. "I know that name. Tell me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down the invoice he'd been holding and folded his hands on the table. "Amos Reed was the scout on my last drive," he said. "He was the one who told me the crossing ropes had been checked and were sound. 2 hours later, 3 of those ropes failed at the same point. Not frayed cut, and then left to look frayed." He paused. "Amos disappeared before the inquiry. I looked for him for 8 months. I assumed he was dead or had been paid to leave." Josie looked at him. "He's at the Ramsey Hotel in Mesa Verde," she said. Rhett didn't move for a moment. Then he pushed back from the table and stood up, and she could see what it cost him, the deliberate, careful containment of something that had been waiting 3 years for a door to open. "I'd like to ride with you tomorrow," he said. "I know." She picked up her lamp. "We leave at first light." She was at the door when he spoke again. "Miss Langford?" She stopped. "The invoices." He picked up the papers he'd been reviewing. "These freight records from last November, there's a shipment logged in Silas Vane's name on the 14th. Look at the quantity and the delivery point." She crossed back to the table and looked where he was pointing. The numbers were small and precise, and she understood immediately what they meant. "He moved cattle," she said. "A lot of cattle. Through a waypoint that doesn't make sense for any legitimate route. Stolen cattle," she said. "That's what these records describe." She looked up at him. "My father kept these." "Your father was building a case." Rhett set the papers down with a kind of careful respect. He was putting it together himself before he got too sick to finish it. Josie looked at the papers for a long time. The lamp was warm in her hand. The house was quiet around her. Martha asleep, the hands in the bunkhouse, the cattle breathing somewhere in the dark pastures beyond the walls. Her father had known. He had known something was wrong and had been quietly documenting it the way a careful man does, not making accusations, just keeping records. He had trusted records. He had taught her to trust them. Someone had altered his will because they knew he was getting close to something. "We ride at first light," she said again. She went to bed and did not sleep. In the morning, the north pasture cattle were recovering. The trough was clean. The sun came up hard and red over the eastern ridge, which in New Mexico in summer meant it was already too hot and would be worse by afternoon. Josie was saddled and at the gate before Rhett had finished buckling his horse's girth. He noticed and didn't comment. They rode out together without ceremony, the way two people ride who have agreed on a direction and don't need to discuss it further. The road to Mesa Verde was 8 miles of rutted dirt that followed the base of the eastern hills before dropping into the flat grid of the town. Josie knew every turn. She'd ridden it with her father as a child, sitting behind him on a gray mare that was long dead, watching the mountains change color as the sun moved. She and Rhett didn't speak much for the first few miles. She was reviewing what she knew about the will, the debt, the dead witnesses, the freight records. He was looking at the land, the way a working cowboy looks at land, taking in the fencing, the water, the condition of the grass, reading the country, the way some men read books. "What are you looking for?" she asked when she'd caught him scanning the same hillside twice. "Your creek runs along that ridge before it comes down to the south pasture," he said. "Someone contaminated your north trough from inside the property. But if I wanted to contaminate a water source without being seen, I'd work from the creek above the intake point, up near that draw. She looked where he was pointing. The draw was a natural fold in the hillside, half hidden behind a stand of juniper. If someone rode in from the eastern road at night, they could reach it without passing any of the ranch buildings. "You think they'll try again," she said. "If you've still got 3 days and they're serious enough to have paid a clerk to alter a will." "Yes." He looked at her. "How many people know you're investigating?" "Martha, you, Pete now. Your hands know something is wrong. Men who've worked a place as long as yours have know it. The question is whether Silas has someone watching the road." She hadn't thought about that specifically. She thought about it now. "Buster worked for Silas for a season 3 years ago," she said, "before I hired him." "Did he say why he left?" "He said the pay was better here." She paused. "It wasn't." Rhett said nothing. He didn't need to. They reached Mesa Verde by 9:30. The town was modest and permanent-looking the way western towns became after they'd survived long enough to stop being surprised by themselves. There was a courthouse, 2 hotels, a dry goods store, a bank, and the offices of the county recorder, which was where Josie needed to go first. "You go to the recorder's office," Rhett said when they reached the main street. "I'll find Amos." She looked at him. "You know what he looks like," he said. "I need to approach him my own way. If he sees me in the street before he's ready, he might run." It was a reasonable argument. She still didn't like dividing their attention. "1 hour," she said. "At the hotel." She went to the county recorder's office and asked to see the full probate file for Hector Langford's estate. The clerk who served her, a young man named Prescott, who was clearly new to the position and nervous about it, disappeared into the back for a long time before returning with a folder. He placed it on the counter and stood close, as if she might take something. The file was thin. Too thin for an estate Hector Langford's size, which had required several years of careful legal documentation. She went through it page by page. The will was there, the version with the marriage clause. The debt documentation was there in Silas Vane's careful hand. 2 letters of correspondence between Whitfield and the county office were there, both dating from the previous spring. What was not there was any record of the original will as filed. What was not there was any of the estate planning documents. Josie knew her father had executed over the previous decade. The property transfer records, the accounts, the long letter he'd dictated to Whitfield 2 years before his death, which had specified that Sunridge would pass to Josie free and clear. "This file has been reviewed recently," she said. Prescott looked uncomfortable. "I wouldn't know about that, ma'am. The documents show different levels of handling. Some of these pages haven't been touched in months. These," she indicated 3 pages near the front, "have been handled recently enough that the fold marks are still fresh." She looked at him. "Who reviewed this file in the past week?" Prescott's discomfort had progressed to something closer to misery. "Mr. Vane came in on Friday," he said very quietly. "He said he was reviewing his own financial documentation. Did he access this file?" He stopped. Started again. "I wasn't at the counter the whole time he was here." Josie looked at him for a moment. He was young and scared, and in a position where the man who probably controlled his salary had left him with knowledge he didn't want. "I'm not going to make trouble for you," she said, which was only partially true. "But I need you to write down right now that Silas Vane reviewed this file on Friday. Sign and date it. Keep a copy for yourself." He stared at her. "Why would I?" "Because if this fraud goes to court, and it will, you don't want to be the person who was standing here when the file was tampered with and said nothing." She kept her voice level and her eyes steady. "You're not a criminal. You're a man who needs his job. I understand that. But there's a difference between protecting yourself and being used." He wrote the note. She didn't take his copy, but she memorized the date and time he wrote. She was at the Ramsay Hotel 12 minutes before the hour was up. Rhett was already there, sitting in the lobby with an old man across from him, whose face looked like country that had weathered everything the weather could manage. Amos Reed was 62 years old and looked every day of it. white-haired, deeply lined, with hands that rested on his knees, with the slight tremor of a man whose body had worked hard for a long time. But his eyes were clear. He looked at Josie when she came in and studied her with the particular assessment of a man deciding whether to trust someone. "Amos," Rhett said, "this is Josephine Langford. She's the one I told you about." Amos Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Rhett. "You should know," Amos said, speaking slowly and with great care, "that I have been afraid for 3 years. I am still afraid. I am telling you this because you are asking me to do something that frightened me enough the first time that I ran away from it, and I want you to understand what you're asking." "I know what I'm asking," Rhett said. "I was there," Amos said. "I checked those ropes myself. They were sound." He looked at his hands. "When we found them cut, I was going to say so at the inquiry. The night before I was supposed to testify, a man came to my room. He didn't threaten me directly. He told me that he had documentation showing I had received money from a cattle buyer in Rosario before the drive, which was a lie, but it was documented, and that if I testified for Calloway, that documentation would be submitted to the court." "Who sent him?" Josie asked. Amos looked at her. The man said his employer was a businessman with interests in the cattle market. He did not give a name. He paused. "But I saw his employer later, 2 months after the inquiry, in Santa Fe at a land sale. He was buying distressed properties." Amos folded his hands. The man was Silas Vane. The hotel lobby was very quiet. Josie looked at Rhett. His face was composed in a way that she understood now as the practiced expression of a man who has spent a long time keeping his emotions where people couldn't get to them. But she could see what was underneath it, not triumph, not relief, but something rawer. The particular ache of a wrong that has been carried a long time, finally being spoken aloud by someone who was there. "Would you testify to this?" she asked Amos. "In a territorial court." He looked at her for a long moment. 3 years ago I was not brave enough," he said. "I have had 3 years to live with that." He straightened slightly in his chair. "Yes, I will testify." She looked at Rhett, who was looking back at her. And in the particular quality of his silence, she understood something she hadn't quite understood before, that he had ridden into her gate exhausted and homeless, and carrying a 3-year-old injustice he hadn't been able to set down, and that what she'd thought was coincidence or desperation on his part was something more complicated than either. He had been looking for a way back to the truth. So had she. They had found each other on a Monday with 5 days to spare. She stood up and smoothed her jacket and thought about everything that still needed to happen. The county records, the freight invoices, the wedding, the court case, the 3 days left on a deadline built on forged paper. "We need to go," she said. They rode back to Sunridge in the afternoon heat, and for the first time since the morning messenger had ridden through her gate, Josie Langford felt something that was not quite confidence. She was too careful for that, but was close enough to it that she didn't immediately push it away. She had a witness. She had freight records her father had kept. She had a stranger who in 48 hours had repaired her fence, treated her cattle, identified a poisoning, found 3 years of missing evidence, and agreed to marry her without asking for anything she hadn't offered first. She was not trusting him blindly. She was watching every move he made and measuring it against the story he'd told. So far, the measurements were holding, but they still had 3 days. And Silas Vane, she knew with absolute certainty, was not finished. She was right. When they came over the last ridge and saw Sunridge below them, there was a horse tied at the barn that she didn't recognize, and Danny Reyes standing at the corral gate with his hat in his hands and his face arranged in the expression of a young man delivering bad news. She put her horse into a canter. The hay shed was still standing, but the south wall had a blackened scorch mark that hadn't been there this morning. And in the doorway, with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, stood Buster Walsh. "What happened?" Josie asked. "Someone tried to light the shed," Buster said. "About an hour ago. I smelled it and got there before it caught. Whoever did it left in a hurry, went over the east fence." She looked at the scorch mark. Whoever had done it had used something oily to try to get a burn started in dry wood. It had nearly worked. "Buster," she said, "tell me honestly, Did you know this was coming? He looked at her directly without flinching. No, ma'am, I swear it. She had to make a decision about whether to believe him. She didn't have enough information to be certain. She made the decision to trust him provisionally because she needed people she could work with, and the calculus of desperation occasionally required extending credit in uncertain directions. All right, she said. I want someone watching this shed all night. Rotate the watch between you, Pete, and Danny, and Buster. She waited until his eyes came back to hers. If you know something you haven't said yet, now is the time. Before Saturday, you can tell me and we can deal with it. After Saturday, everything changes. He held her gaze. I don't know anything, but I'll watch the shed. She went into the house. Martha was at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee and the expression she wore when she was prepared to be useful. Sit down, Martha said. Josie sat. Rhett came in behind her, took a chair without being invited, and poured his own coffee. You found Amos Reed, Martha said. It was not a question. Yes. And, Josie told her. Martha listened without interrupting, a rarer gift than people appreciated. When Josie finished, Martha was quiet for the moment, turning her cup in both hands. So Silas Vane destroyed 2 lives with the same scheme, Martha said. Your ranch and this man's reputation. And now he's trying to use a dead lawyer's name to finish what he started. Yes. Martha looked at Rhett. And you're still willing to go through with this marriage? Yes. Even knowing that it puts you in the middle of a legal fight with a man who's already shown he's willing to tamper with witnesses. Rhett met her eyes. A man who could do what was done to me, cut ropes over a river crossing and let cattle and possibly men die, so he could buy the surviving herd for nothing. That's not a man who improves with time. He's going to keep doing this to people. He paused. I've got reason enough. Martha studied him for a long private moment that Josie recognized as the particular assessment her aunt had been making her whole life, not of words, but of the person behind the words, of the quality of silence between sentences, of whether a man's eyes moved the right way when he said things he needed people to believe. All right, Martha said. She poured more coffee. Outside, the evening light was changing, going gold, and then amber, and then the particular deep orange that preceded dark. Josie could hear Buster moving near the hay shed. She could hear the cattle settling in the north pasture. She thought about her father bent over his ledgers in the last months when the illness was taking him faster than either of them had admitted. She thought about him keeping those freight records, not confronting Silas, not accusing, just documenting the way a careful man does, building the kind of case that doesn't collapse when someone pushes it. He had known, and he had left her the tools to finish it. She looked at Rhett Calloway across the kitchen table. This man she had known for 30 hours. This man who had arrived with an exhausted horse and a ruined reputation and an unexpected alignment of purpose. And she thought about what it meant to trust not the person, but the evidence of their character. She had not yet trusted him entirely, but she was gathering evidence. Howe was doing the same with her. She could see it in the way he watched and listened and measured his responses, not calculating, but careful. A person who had been hurt by careless faith and was not ready to extend it again without examination. That, more than anything, was what made her think they might actually be able to do this. She had 4 days left. She had freight records, a witness, a dead lawyer's signature on a fraudulent document, and a man sitting across her kitchen table who had walked into the worst week of her life and hadn't tried to make it about himself. She did not know yet if it would be enough. But she had stopped believing it was impossible. That was going to have to be enough for tonight. She did not sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, though she was honest enough with herself to admit that. But because the moment she closed her eyes, the numbers started moving again. The freight records, the dates on the witness signatures, the gap between when Whitfield died and when the county filed the altered will. She lay in the dark and arranged the pieces the way her father had taught her to arrange a difficult ledger, not looking for what she wanted to find, but looking for what was actually there. What was actually there was a pattern. And patterns, her father had always said, don't lie the way people do. She was up before the sun. Rhett was already at the barn when she came out. He had fed the horses and was working on the wagon wheel he'd noticed the day before, replacing the worn iron on the rim with the quiet efficiency of a man who didn't need daylight to find a task or company to start one. He looked up when she came through the door. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you." "I slept 2 hours." He set down the hammer. "What are you thinking?" She told him what she'd been working through in the dark, the specific timeline, the way the dates connected. Whitfield had died in February. The county had filed the altered will in March. Silas had visited the county recorder's office on the Friday before the messenger rode out to Sunridge. That was not coincidence. That was a sequence. He needed Whitfield gone before he could file, she said. As long as the original lawyer was alive, there was someone who could testify to what the actual will said. "You think Whitfield's death wasn't natural?" "I think it's worth asking questions about." She looked at him. The county records showed Whitfield died of fever. He was 53 years old and had no history of serious illness. Rhett was quiet for the moment. "If we start making that accusation without proof, Silas will use it to discredit everything else we bring to court." "I know." She picked up the freight records she'd brought from the house. "That's why we don't make the accusation. We present the pattern and let a judge decide what it means." He looked at her with something she was beginning to recognize as appreciation, not the kind men offered women when they performed competence in front of them, as if it were a surprise, but the kind one person extends to another when they recognize that the person across from them is thinking at the same speed they are. "You've done this before," he said. "I had to renegotiate a water rights contract 3 years ago with a man who had a lawyer, and I didn't," she said. "You learn to build a case before you walk into the room." They ate breakfast, standing at the kitchen counter. Martha was already up moving with the purposeful economy of a woman who knew exactly what needed to happen and intended to make sure it did. She had made biscuits, the kind she made when she judged a day would be long enough to require provisions, and she had already packed a saddlebag with food and a small medical kit, which she placed on the table without comment. "You're riding into town," she said. "County Records Office first," Josie said. "Then the bank." Martha looked at Rhett. "You go with her." "I was planning to." "Don't plan, do." She pointed at the biscuits. "Eat those first." They reached Mesa Verde by 8 o'clock. The town was not yet fully awake at that hour. The dry goods store was opening its shutters. A freight wagon was unloading outside the bank, and 2 men Josie didn't recognize were sitting outside the hotel in the early morning quiet. She noticed them, the way she'd learned to notice things in the past 2 days, cataloging, filing, not yet deciding what they meant. At the county records office, the young clerk Prescott was already behind the counter. He looked at Josie when she came in, and then quickly at something to his left, a door that led to the back offices, and then back at her, which told her something she needed to know. "I need to see the full estate records for Hector Langford," she said. "All files including correspondence." "Miss Langford." He lowered his voice. "Mr. Vane was here this morning." She kept her expression neutral. "How early?" "Before I arrived. The night clerk said he came in just after 6. 6 in the morning. Silas Vane had been at the county records office before the town was properly awake, which meant he knew she was coming, which meant someone at Sunridge had told him she'd been to the office the day before, which meant the problem inside her own ranch was worse than she'd thought. "Did he access the Langford file?" Rhett asked from behind her shoulder. Prescott's silence was its own answer. "What did he take?" Josie asked. I can't say that he took anything, Miss Langford. I wasn't here." "What's missing from the file?" Another silence. Longer. "The correspondence between Mr. Whitfield and my father," she said. "Is it still there?" Prescott turned and went to the back. He was gone 4 minutes, she counted, and when he came back, his face had the pale, careful look of a man who has found confirmation of something he'd hoped was wrong. "The correspondence folder is empty," he said. Josie put both hands flat on the counter and breathed. Once, deliberately. She did not allow herself the luxury of a reaction that would cost her time she didn't have. "Who had access to the file between my visit yesterday and this morning?" she asked. "I can check the log." "Please do that, right now." He checked. 3 names herself. Silas Vane on the previous Friday, and a name she didn't recognize. J. Hargrove logged in at 6:14 that morning. "Who is J. Hargrove?" Rhett asked. Prescott looked genuinely uncertain. "I don't know. He's not a regular at this office." Josie looked at Rhett. Rhett looked at her. The same thought moved between them without requiring words. Silas had sent someone else, so his own name wouldn't appear on this morning's log. He was being careful. He was also being fast, which meant he was worried. Good. A worried man makes mistakes. "I need to look at every other file in this office that shows Silas Vane's name," she said. "Estate transfers, land claims, loan instruments, all of it." Prescott hesitated. There's quite a lot of—" "I have 3 days," she said. "Start pulling files." She spent 2 hours in the county records office. Rhett sat across the table from her, and they divided the files between them, working through them with the focused quiet of people who have agreed on a method and don't need to renegotiate the process at each step. She would mark a page with a slip of paper and pass the file to him. He would look at what she'd marked, write the relevant dates and figures in a small notebook he'd produced from his coat pocket, and set it aside. What they found file by file was Silas Vane's business model laid out in careful legal language. He had acquired 7 ranches in the past 8 years. In every case, the pattern was the same: a loan issued at reasonable terms, a period of normal repayment, and then following some document or amendment that appeared in the file after the original loan. A sudden change in terms, an increased debt amount, a new clause that the original owner almost certainly had not agreed to. 3 of the 7 ranches had been transferred under circumstances almost identical to what Josie was facing. 2 of those original owners were dead. The 3rd had moved to Colorado. "He's done this before," Josie said. Not a revelation, she'd suspected it. But seeing it laid out in 7 separate files was different from suspecting it. It was the difference between knowing a storm is coming and watching it arrive. "More than once," Rhett said, "and he's refined it. The early transfers are rougher, the document amendments are more obvious. By the time he gets to your father's file, he's good at it." She looked at the notebook he'd been keeping. The figures were clean and precise, each entry dated and sourced. She realized, watching him work, that he had a careful, methodical mind beneath the cowboy exterior, the kind of mind that had probably made him a good trail foreman, and also the kind of mind that Silas Vane would have recognized as dangerous, which would explain why he'd gone to the trouble of destroying Rhett's reputation rather than simply firing him. "We need copies of those records," she said. "Prescott." "I know." She stood up and went back to the counter. Prescott was watching them with an expression that had moved from nervous to something closer to engaged, the look of a young man watching something that was starting to matter more than his fear of his employer. "I need certified copies of 7 estate files. Can you do that today?" "It would take most of the afternoon." "I'll pay for your time." "What's the cost?" he told her. She didn't flinch at the number. "I'll have them ready by 4 o'clock, he said. She thanked him and meant it and went back to where Rhett was waiting. "The bank," she said. The Mesa Verde Territorial Bank occupied a solid stone building on the main street, and its manager, a careful man named Theodore Arch, had done business with the Langford family for 11 years. He knew Josie by name and stood to greet her when she came in, which was a professional courtesy he did not extend to everyone. He also, she noticed, immediately knew Rhett Calloway's name, though not in a good way. "Miss Langford." Arch shook her hand. Then his eyes moved to Rhett, and something shifted in them. "I wasn't aware you were traveling with—" "Mr. Calloway is working for Sunridge Ranch," she said. "In what capacity he works is my concern, not yours. I'm here about my father's loan account." Arch sat down behind his desk, with the careful movements of a man recalibrating his approach. "Of course. What specifically?" "I want to see every amendment to the loan documentation since my father became too ill to manage his own accounts. Every change, every addendum, every modification in terms." Arch opened his desk drawer, then closed it again. "Miss Langford, those records are—" "My father's accounts," she said, "which I have managed as his authorized representative for the past 2 years. I have paperwork establishing my authority to review those records, which I am happy to place on your desk." She did. I would also like to know who authorized the debt increase that appears in the county estate file, because my father did not authorize it, and I did not authorize it, and you are the only other party who legally could have. The silence in Theodore Arch's office was very different from the silence in the county records office. That had been the silence of a young clerk deciding whether to be brave. This was the silence of a middle-aged man deciding whether he'd made a mistake he could no longer manage alone. Rhett sat in the chair to Josie's left and said nothing. He was very good at strategic silence. She was beginning to appreciate it. The debt modification was authorized by a power of attorney document, Arch said finally, filed last October. Show me. He took a file from the cabinet behind him and placed it on the desk. She turned it toward her and read the power of attorney document. The signature was her father's. The date was October. At that point, her father had been ill for 6 months, ill enough that he'd been relying on her for his correspondence, his accounts, and most of his daily decisions. He had not, to her certain knowledge, executed any new legal documents in October without her being present. Who witnessed this? She asked. Arnold Whitfield. She looked up. Arch was watching her with the careful stillness of a man who has already understood where this conversation is going and is deciding whether to arrive there voluntarily or be dragged. Mr. Arch, she said, I want you to think carefully about your next answer. Did you personally verify this power of attorney before acting on it? A long pause. We rely on the witnessing attorney to verify. That is not what I asked. Another pause. Longer. No, he said. I did not personally verify it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached across the desk, picked up the power of attorney document, and set it beside her notebook. I'll need a certified copy of this, she said. He made the copy himself. She took it and stood up. One more thing, she said. When Silas Vane speaks to you, and I think he will speak to you very soon, I want you to remember that there is a territorial court judge who will return to this county in approximately 1 week, and I want you to consider which side of this you'd rather be on when he arrives. She walked out without waiting for his answer. On the street, Rhett caught up with her in 3 strides. That was a risk, he said. If he tells Silas, he'll tell Silas. That's fine. She kept walking. I want Silas to know what I found. I want him nervous. A nervous man makes moves he hasn't planned carefully, and unplanned moves leave evidence. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you've done this before. 3rd time you've said that. 3rd time I've been right. She almost smiled. She didn't quite, because they were on a public street in Mesa Verde, and there were things she couldn't afford to let show. But the almost was there, and she thought he probably saw it. They ate at a small lunch counter near the hotel, and she spread her notes on the table between the plates and worked through what they had while he ate with the efficiency of a man who has learned to take food when it's available. Watching him across the scarred wooden table with the county records notebook between them and the fake power of attorney in her folder, and 2 hours remaining before Prescott would have her certified copies ready, she thought about what she had actually assembled in less than 48 hours. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, significant. But it was not yet enough for a courtroom, and the courtroom was ultimately where this would have to go. We need Amos's testimony formalized, she said, written and witnessed. He'll do it. I need to talk to him again this afternoon, before we ride back. She looked at the notebook. And I need to find out whether any of the other ranchers Silas worked this scheme on are still in this territory. 2 of them are dead, Rhett said. The 3rd went to Colorado. There are 7 files, 2 dead, 1 gone. That leaves 4. He looked up from his plate. The calculation in his eyes was immediate and sharp. The other 4 ranchers, she said. If their files show the same pattern, and they do, we both read them, then they may have the same experience, the same amended documents, the same dead witnesses. She held his eyes. If they'll talk, we're not presenting one woman's disputed inheritance. We're presenting a business model. Rhett set down his fork. That changes the scope, he said. That changes everything. He sat back and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful steadiness he usually maintained, but something more unguarded. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like the particular combination of shock and recognition a person feels when they've been thinking along one road and suddenly see that it connects to a much larger territory. "You're not just trying to save your ranch," he said. "I'm trying to make sure he can't do it to the next one." She gathered her notes. "Now finish eating. We have work to do." They found Amos Reed in the hotel's small back sitting room, where he'd taken up residence with a cup of coffee and a year-old newspaper. He looked up when they came in and put the paper down with the manner of a man who has been expecting them. Josie laid out what she needed, a written statement witnessed and signed detailing everything he'd told them the previous day about the cattle drive, the cut ropes, and the man he'd later identified as Silas Vane. Amos listened with his hands folded and his eyes steady. "If I sign this," he said when she'd finished, "and it goes to court, you'll be protected," she said. "Not by me personally. I won't pretend I can make that guarantee, but by the weight of the other evidence. A single witness can be discredited. A witness who corroborates a documented pattern of fraud is harder to dismiss." Amos looked at Rhett. "You believe her?" Rhett met the old man's eyes. "I think she's the most dangerous person in this county right now. Yes, I believe her." Amos considered this for a long moment. Then he reached out and took the paper. He wrote his statement in careful, unhurried longhand. It took 20 minutes. Josie and Rhett sat across from him and did not rush him, and when he finished, he read it through once, made 2 small corrections, and signed it. The hotel manager, when asked, agreed to witness the signature for a small fee. He did not ask what the document concerned. When they walked back out to the street, Josie felt the weight of what they were carrying, not the physical paper, but the structure of it. The 7 estate files and what they showed. The false power of attorney. Prescott's note about Silas visiting the records office. The freight records her father had kept. And now Amos's signed testimony about a cattle drive and cut ropes and a businessman who had built his fortune on other people's catastrophes. It was not enough yet, but it was the architecture of enough. They picked up the certified copies from Prescott at 4 o'clock, and she shook his hand at the counter, which made him stand slightly straighter. They were halfway back to Sunridge when Rhett's horse threw a shoe. It happened fast, a sudden lameness, a change in gait, and Rhett was off the animal before Josie had fully registered what was wrong. He checked the hoof with quick, practiced hands, found the problem, and stood up. "It's not injured," he said, "but I can't ride her like this." Josie looked at the road. They were 4 miles from Sunridge and an equal distance from Mesa Verde. The afternoon was moving. "Ride with me," she said. He looked at her horse, then at her. "Your horse can carry 2, she said. It was not a question. She knew horses. He looped his mare's reins to a fence post she'd send Pete back with the spare horse in the morning and came to her side. Getting up behind her was a matter of logistics, not sentiment, and she treated it as such. The horse adjusted, settled, and moved forward. The problem was that 4 miles on horseback is not a short distance, and a horse carrying double moves more slowly than a horse carrying one. And the sun was dropping, and they were close enough together that she could feel the warmth of him behind her, and she was trying very hard to think about the 7 estate files and the certified copies in her saddlebag, and not about the fact that in 3 days she was going to marry this man. "You're thinking very loudly," he said. "I'm thinking about the court case." "Of course you are." She could hear something in his voice that might have been dry amusement, and she decided not to address it. "We need to talk about the wedding itself," she said instead. "The legal requirements. Who needs to be present, what paperwork has to be filed, what the county recorder's office needs to see before they'll record a marriage certificate." "Have you been married before?" he asked. "No." A pause. "You?" "No." "Then we'll have to find out the territorial requirements." "I know the requirements," he said. "I've had reason to review New Mexico territorial marriage law in the past several months." She twisted slightly to look at him, which was awkward on horseback. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, in a way that felt considered rather than evasive. "Because I was looking for a legal mechanism," he said. "Before I found you. I thought if I could establish a settled position, a partnership with a legitimate operation, I'd have grounds to challenge the legal record that followed me from the Rosario inquiry." He paused again. Marriage to a property owner establishes residency and legal standing in a way that a hired hand's wages don't. I was thinking about the mechanism. Not... He stopped. Not looking for a specific woman, she finished. No. And now? The question sat between them in the cooling afternoon air. She hadn't meant to ask it, but she had, and they were on a horse together with 3 days until their wedding, and she had made a rule about truth. He said after a moment, "Now I'm less interested in the mechanism." She turned back to face forward. The horse moved steadily beneath them. She didn't answer. But she kept the answer she didn't give, in a careful place, separate from the legal files and the courtroom strategy and the 5-day deadline somewhere. She could think about it when she had time for something other than survival. They were a mile from Sunridge when she smelled it. Not Jimson weed this time. Something sharper, hotter. She put the horse into a canter without explaining, and she heard Rhett grip the saddle behind her, and then they came over the last ridge and saw it, the hay shed and the east wall of it, fully alight. The fire moving fast in the dry evening air, and Danny Reyes sprinting from the barn with the bucket line already forming. She was off the horse before it had stopped moving. She ran. The next 40 minutes were the most concentrated and physical of Josie Langford's life in years. The hay shed was 3/4 lost before they got the line working. But the barn with 12 horses and 10 years of equipment, and her father's saddle hung on the third peg from the left, the barn they saved. By inches, by speed, by the particular focused desperation of people fighting for something they cannot afford to lose. When it was over, the hay shed was a ruin of charred lumber and smoke. The barn was standing. Everyone was on their feet. She stood in the yard with her hands blackened and her lungs aching from the smoke and looked at what was left. Buster came to her. His face was ash-marked and tight with something that wasn't quite fear. "Miss Josie," he said, "I found something when I was fighting the east wall, under the lumber stack that went first." He held out his hand. In it was a small tin, the kind of tin you kept tobacco in, or percussion caps for a rifle. But this tin had been modified. Inside it, burned around the edges, but still partially readable, was a piece of paper with numbers on it. She looked at the numbers. Then she looked at Buster. "Do you recognize this handwriting?" she asked. He said nothing. "Buster." Her voice was level. "I told you this morning that now was the time. That's still true. It will not be true after tonight." He looked at the tin. He looked at her. And she watched something in him. Something that had been under pressure for a long time. Reached the point where the cost of keeping it was finally higher than the cost of letting it go. "The handwriting is Deputy Hale's," he said. "Carl Hale. He's been working for Silas on the side for 2 years. I knew he was taking money." He closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't know it was this. I swear to God, Miss Josie, I didn't know it was this." Josie looked at the deputy's handwriting on the partially burned paper numbers that corresponded to what appeared to be a payment schedule, and at the top, a single word that made the entire thing clear: accelerate. Silas had told his deputy to accelerate. The poison trough, the attempted fire, the morning visit to the records office. It was all the same instruction, all the same urgency. Because Silas was frightened. Because someone had been in his records office asking questions and taking notes. Because she had spent 2 days building a case instead of panicking. "Where is Deputy Hale now?" Rhett asked from behind her. "He rode out toward the eastern road about an hour before the fire started," Danny offered from the edge of the group. "I thought he was on patrol." "He was clearing a conscience," Rhett said. His voice was quiet and controlled. He knew what was going to happen, and he didn't want to be here for it. Josie looked at the burned shed. She looked at the barn they'd saved by minutes. She looked at Buster Walsh's face, which had aged 10 years in the last 2 hours. "Buster," she said, "tomorrow morning you're going to come with me to Mesa Verde, and you're going to tell the sheriff exactly what you just told me. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She turned to the group. "Danny, Pete, I need the watch doubled tonight. 2 men on the barn, 2 on the house perimeter, rotating every 2 hours. We're not losing anything else." She looked at Rhett. "Come inside. In the kitchen." Martha already had the coffee going. She took one look at Josie and went to the stove without speaking. Josie sat down, placed the tin and the partially burned paper on the table, and felt for the first time that day the weight of everything pressing down through the chair and into the floor. She had 2 days left. She had a deputy on Silas's payroll, a burned hay shed, 7 estate files, a false power of attorney, a signed witness statement, and a man sitting across her kitchen table who had promised her the truth. She needed to tell him something she hadn't yet said. "Rhett," she said. He looked up. "If this works." She stopped and started again. "When we go into court, Silas is going to attack every piece of this. He's going to attack the estate files as irrelevant to my case. He's going to attack Amos's testimony as the statement of a bitter old man who blames everyone but himself. He's going to attack the power of attorney by saying my father executed it willingly." She paused. "And then, he's going to attack you. He's going to say you married me to get my land, that you saw a vulnerable woman with a property dispute and rode in precisely when she was desperate." Rhett looked at her steadily. "I know. He's going to make it about you and me, not about the documents." "I know that too." "The marriage agreement," she said. "The one surrendering your claims. That's the thing that defeats his argument. But only if it's filed before we walk into that courthouse." "I had the same thought," he said. He reached into his coat and placed a folded paper on the table. "I drafted it this afternoon at the records office while you were talking to Prescott." She opened it. The language was plain and precise, surrendering every possible legal claim he might acquire through marriage to her property, her cattle, her water rights, her accounts, and any future earnings of the Sunridge Ranch operation. It was thorough. It was also, she realized as she read it, something he'd thought about carefully, not a man protecting himself from accusation, but a man who understood what would damage her case, and had removed it without being asked. She looked at him across the table. There were things she wanted to say that she wasn't ready to say, and things she needed to do that required the morning, and Martha was putting coffee cups on the table, and through the window she could see Pete making his way toward the barn with a lantern. "Tomorrow," she said, "we get Buster's statement to the sheriff. We find out which of the other ranchers are still in this territory, and we file this." She put her hand flat on the marriage agreement. "By tomorrow night I want everything in order." "And tonight?" he asked. She looked at the table, at the tin at her blackened hands. "Tonight," she said, "I'm going to write down everything we know. Every date, every name, every document, every connection. So that if something happens to me before Saturday, someone else can finish it." The kitchen went very quiet. Martha set down the coffee pot. She looked at Josie with an expression that contained both love and pain and complete understanding. "Nothing's going to happen to you," Rhett said. His voice was quiet, but it was not a comfort. It was a statement of intent. "No," she agreed, "but I'm writing it down anyway." She pulled a blank ledger from the shelf, the same kind her father had used, the same green cover, the same heavy pages, and she opened it to the first page and began. She wrote until 2 in the morning. The ledger filled slowly, and then faster. The way a difficult thing sometimes becomes easier once you commit to it completely. She wrote every name, every date, every document reference, every conversation she could reconstruct. She wrote what she knew and what she suspected, and she kept those two categories clearly separated, the way her father had taught her, because a ledger that confuses fact with assumption is worse than no ledger at all. Rhett stayed at the table. He didn't hover. He didn't offer suggestions she hadn't asked for. He refilled her coffee once without comment, and when she paused to think through a sequence, he waited. When she asked him to confirm a date from the freight records, he found it immediately. They worked together in the lamp-lit kitchen with the particular quiet of two people who have agreed on a purpose and are moving toward it. Martha went to bed at midnight, but she left the lamp oil full and a fresh candle on the counter. This was Martha's way of saying she was present even when she wasn't in the room. When Josie finally closed the ledger, she sat for a moment with her hands on the cover and looked at what she'd built. If something happened to her before Saturday, and she was not being dramatic, she was being practical, because Silas Vane had already burned her hay shed and poisoned her cattle, and she was under no illusion about what a man with that much at stake might try next. Someone could pick up this ledger and understand everything. Is it complete? Red asked. As complete as I can make it tonight. She looked at him. He was tired, she could see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight heaviness around his eyes. But he was the kind of tired that comes from sustained effort, rather than the kind that asks for sympathy. You should sleep. So should you. I will. She picked up the ledger and held it for a moment. I'm going to leave this with Martha. Not in the house in the kitchen garden, in the box where she keeps her seed packets. Silas has been inside this county system long enough to know where to look in a house. He won't look in a garden box. Rhett looked at her with the expression she was beginning to think of as his particular form of respect. That's a good instinct. It's what my father would have done. She stood up. He was always more careful about hiding things than about finding them. He said the finding was the easy part if you'd hidden well enough. She put the ledger in Martha's garden box before she went to bed. She slept 4 hours and woke before the sun. The morning came in cold, which was unusual for summer in New Mexico, and she took it as a sign that the day was going to be unusual in other ways too. She was right. By 7 o'clock, she and Rhett and Buster Walsh were riding toward Mesa Verde. Buster had the hollow look of a man who hadn't slept, which was honest of him, and he rode in silence with his hat pulled low. Josie didn't try to fill the quiet. The night had taken something out of all of them, and the day ahead was going to require what was left. Sheriff Olin Pruitt was 58 years old and had been law in Mesa Verde for 14 years. He was not a dramatic man or a corrupt one, which made him somewhat unusual in a county where Silas Vane had spent 8 years arranging the furniture of local government to his own advantage. Pruitt had not been arranged. He was the kind of man who had simply never been offered the right price, or perhaps the kind whose price was too high for even Silas to pay. He listened to Buster Walsh without interrupting. Buster told everything. The money from Deputy Hale, the instructions he'd been given to watch the roads and report Josie's movements, the $200 he'd been paid in September to give Hale access to the property after dark. He had not, he said repeatedly and with genuine anguish, known about the fire. He had not known about the cattle. He had thought he was providing information to a businessman protecting a legitimate debt claim, and when the fire happened, he understood what he'd actually been part of. Pruitt listened to all of it. Then he looked at Josie. Can you corroborate this? He asked. She placed the tin on his desk. The partially burned paper with Hale's handwriting. Prescott's signed note about Silas's Friday visit. The hotel manager's witnessed signature on Amos Reed's statement. Pruitt picked up each item and examined it with the slow thoroughness of a man who does not form opinions quickly, but holds them firmly once formed. Carl Hale, he said. Where is he? Josie asked. He came in this morning at 6. He's on duty. Pruitt stood up. Excuse me a moment. He was gone 11 minutes. She knew because she counted. Rhett sat beside her and did not speak, and she was grateful for that. When Pruitt came back, his expression had settled into something harder. Hale is not on the premises, he said. His deputy's badge is on the desk in the back office. He sat down. He's run. The room went very still. He knew we were coming, Rhett said. Someone told him, Josie said. She looked at Buster, not with accusation, but with a direct, measuring question. Buster held up both hands. I didn't speak to anyone last night. I swear it. I went to my bunk and I stayed there. Someone in town, Rhett said. When we were at the records office yesterday, the 2 men outside the hotel. She'd noticed them, filed them away. She pulled the memory up now and looked at it properly. One of them went inside, she said slowly. When we came out of the records office, I saw him from the corner. I didn't think... She stopped. He went to the telegraph office, not the hotel. Pruitt was watching her. Silas has someone watching the county building, she said. When I went in asking for files and certified copies, whoever was watching sent word, and Silas told Hale to leave before we could get to him. Pruitt leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was the look of a man who is not surprised exactly, but who has been confirmed in something he had suspected and not wanted to fully believe. Silas Vane, he said more to himself than to them. Yes, Josie said. The same Silas Vane who is currently attempting to acquire my ranch through a falsified will clause and a fraudulent power of attorney using the authority of this county's legal system. She kept her voice even. Sheriff Pruitt, I have 2 days. I have documentation that this man has run this scheme 7 times in this county, that he has used 2 dead lawyers as false witnesses, and that he has now directed an officer of this county to commit arson on my property. I need you to tell me what you can do. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. I can issue a warrant for Hale, he said. Arson and dereliction. And Silas, on the evidence you've shown me today. He paused carefully. I can open an inquiry, but an inquiry doesn't stop a probate order, Miss Langford. That's a court matter. I know. She gathered her papers. I'm not asking you to stop the court order. I'm asking you to have a record established before Saturday, so that when this goes before the territorial judge, there's a sheriff's inquiry already attached to it. She met his eyes. It's harder to dismiss a fraud case when the law is already asking questions. He looked at her for a long moment. You're very much like your father, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm still here. He filed the inquiry that morning. She had his signed confirmation before 10 o'clock. On the street outside the sheriff's office, she stopped and looked at what she had and what she still needed. 2 days. A wedding tomorrow. A courthouse appearance to file the marriage agreement and the estate challenge before the noon deadline on Saturday. The other ranchers, she said. Rhett nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing. I can ask around. There's a man named Farley Dobbs. He had a ranch on the northern boundary that transferred to Vane's Holdings 2 years ago. I saw his name in the files, if he's still in the territory. Find him. She turned to Buster. Go home. Talk to Pete and Danny. Tell them what happened this morning and that I need them steady today. Don't speak to anyone else. Buster went. Rhett found Farley Dobbs at the feed store loading grain into a wagon. He couldn't really afford living now in a rented room in Mesa Verde and working odd jobs since he'd lost the ranch he'd built over 15 years. He was 54 years old and had the particular bitterness of a man who had been wronged and had stopped expecting justice. He looked at Rhett's face when Rhett told him why he was asking, and then he looked past Rhett to where Josie was standing outside the feed store watching. Is she going to court? He asked. Before Saturday, Rhett said. Farley Dobbs looked at the grain bags in his wagon. He looked at his hands. He looked at the town around him, the town where he'd once been a property owner and was now a day laborer. What do you need? He said. He had his own records. That was the thing that undid Silas Vane's careful architecture more than anything else. The fact that Farley Dobbs, a man who had lost everything, had kept his paperwork. He had the original loan document, which showed the terms that had later been altered. He had 2 letters from Whitfield's office that didn't match the correspondence currently on file at the county recorders. He had a bill of sale for cattle that should have offset his debt but had never been credited to his account. He had them in a canvas sack under his rented bed, where he'd kept them for 2 years against the day when someone asked. Josie sat across from Farley Dobbs at the lunch counter and looked at his papers and felt something sharp and complicated move through her grief for this man, and rage at the system that had let it happen, and a fierce, cold determination to make sure the papers in the canvas sack were worth something. Will you testify? She asked. He looked at her. In court, before the territorial judge, within the week if I can get this moving fast enough. He'll come after me, Farley said. Silas, he'll find some way. He's going to be busy, Rhett said. Farley looked at him for a long moment. Something passed between them. The particular understanding of 2 men who had been taken apart by the same machinery and were looking at a chance to reverse the gears. Yes, Farley said. I'll testify. They were back at Sunridge by mid-afternoon, and Josie went directly to the barn to check the horses and the watch rotation, and then to the house to find Martha, and then to the kitchen table to organize everything she'd gathered into the order she would present it when the time came. The time was coming fast. That evening, she and Rhett were in the barn. She was checking a mare's hoof that had been tender, and he was mending a broken bridle when she heard the sound of a rider coming through the gate. Fast. Too fast for a social call. It was Danny Reyes, and he'd been running. Deputy's back, Danny said, breathless. Not hail a new one. Came from the county seat. He's got papers. Josie set down the hoof. What kind of papers? Arrest warrant. She looked at Rhett. For you, Danny said. He was looking at Rhett. For the cattle theft, the Rosario Drive. Someone refiled the complaint. The barn went very quiet. She looked at Rhett's face. He had gone still in the way she had come to recognize not frozen, but controlled, contained, processing. Silas, he said. He knows we found Amos, she said. He knows we have the freight records. He's trying to remove you before the wedding. She was already moving toward the house. He needs you in jail when Saturday comes. Without a husband, the marriage condition can't be met. Even if I prove the will is false, I lose time, and time is what he's counting on. She was in the house and at the desk before Rhett had come through the door. She pulled the freight records, the certified copies from the county files, and the one document she hadn't shown anyone yet, a shipping manifest she'd found tucked into the back of her father's ledger the night she'd written everything down. She hadn't been certain what it meant until now. It was a delivery record, dated 3 days after the Rosario River crossing. It showed a cattle shipment the size consistent with the surviving at a holding yard outside Rosario. The name on the delivery was a company she now recognized from the 7 estate files, a shell business that traced back to Silas Vane. Silas had taken the cattle. He had taken them before the inquiry. Before Rhett had even reached town to defend himself, the cattle had already been sold under Silas's company name. He sold the cattle before the case was closed, she said. If you had stolen them, they'd have been evidence. You couldn't have sold them. He sold them because he had them, because he took them, not you. Rhett took the manifest and looked at it. His jaw was set in a hard, careful line. This proves I didn't sell them, he said. It proves you couldn't have, because they were already sold, by him. She picked up her coat. You're not being arrested tonight. Josie, you're not. She turned to face him, and whatever he saw in her expression made him stop. If he gets you in that jail, I lose the next 2 days. I lose the wedding. I lose the filing deadline. I lose the case. He knows exactly what he's doing. She picked up the manifest. The new deputy has a warrant. That warrant is based on a refiled complaint that is directly contradicted by this document. I am going to ride into town right now and show it to Sheriff Pruitt, and Pruitt is going to tell the new deputy that the complaint has material evidentiary problems, and that deputy is going to stand down. And if Pruitt doesn't, then I will stand on the street in front of the county office and read this manifest aloud until someone with the authority to act on it hears me. She looked at him steadily. Go saddle the horses. Martha appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had her coat on already. I'm coming, she said. It was not a question, and Josie did not treat it as one. They rode into Mesa Verde in the last light of the evening. The 3 of them, Josie and Rhett and Martha, and the new deputy, was still at the county office when they arrived. A young man from the county seat named Briggs, who had the look of someone who had been handed an assignment he didn't fully understand and was beginning to suspect he'd been given incomplete information. Pruitt was there too. He'd been waiting. I heard Briggs was coming, Pruitt said when Josie walked in. I stayed late. She placed the shipping manifest on his desk. He read it. He handed it to Briggs. Briggs read it with the particular expression of a young official watching his certainty reorganize itself around new facts. This document shows the cattle from the Rosario Drive were sold by a company connected to Silas Vane, Josie said. 3 days after the crossing, before the inquiry, before Rhett Calloway was formally accused. She looked at Briggs. If Mr. Calloway had stolen and sold those cattle, they would have been held as evidence by the party filing the complaint, which was the original rancher McCready, who was working in partnership with Vane. They were not held, they were sold, by the man who is currently attempting to use this arrest warrant to keep Mr. Calloway from getting married tomorrow morning. Briggs looked at the manifest. He looked at Pruitt. Pruitt shrugged in the manner of a man who has already formed his opinion and is waiting for the younger man to catch up. The complaint has a material evidentiary problem, he said. I'd stand the warrant down until it can be reviewed by the territorial court. Briggs stood the warrant down. He didn't look happy about it, but he did it. Outside on the street in the dark, that had fully settled while they were inside, Josie stood and felt the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical work, but from sustained high-stakes thinking. She was tired in a way that went down to her bones. Rhett stood beside her. "You didn't need to do all that," he said. "Yes, I did." "I meant," he paused. "You could have let them take me. Filed the challenge to the will on your own. You had enough documentation." She looked at him. The street was quiet around them, the town shutting down for the night, a lantern burning in the hotel window. "We made an agreement," she said. "No pretending when we're alone, no hiding things." She turned to face him fully. "I am not going to let Silas Vane use you as a piece on his board. Not because I need you present at the wedding, though I do, but because what he's doing to you is wrong, and I have the means to stop it." He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light was doing something to his face, making it less careful somehow, more open. "Josie," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name without the title. She felt it in a way she didn't have room for right now. "Tomorrow," she said. "We can talk about everything tomorrow. Tonight I need to sleep, and so do you." He nodded. But he didn't move for a moment, and she didn't either. Martha's voice came from behind them, dry and serene. "The horses are waiting." They rode back to Sunridge. She checked the watch rotation. She checked the barn. She checked the garden box where she'd hidden the ledger, still there, undisturbed, the seed packets undisturbed around it. She went inside and laid out the documents she would need in the morning, in the order she would need them, and then she went to bed. She slept 6 hours, which was more than she'd expected. She woke to Martha's voice through the door. "He's here." Josie sat up. "Who?" "Silas. In the yard. With 4 men." She was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. Silas Vane was standing in the morning yard with his hat in his hands. A careful, deliberate gesture of civility, and 4 men arranged behind him with the relaxed readiness of people who were not expecting resistance, but were prepared for it. He looked at Josie when she came through the door, and then at Rhett, who had come from the bunkhouse direction and was now standing to her right. "Miss Langford," Silas said, "I wanted to come personally, to offer one final opportunity." "You've had your opportunities," she said. "You're making a serious mistake." His voice was still careful, still reasonable. It was the voice of a man who believed that reasonableness was power, and for most of his life, in most of his dealings, he had been right about that. "The document you found, the shipping manifest, is a company record from a legitimate operation. It won't hold the weight you think it will. Maybe not alone," she said. "Together with 7 estate files, a fraudulent power of attorney, a sheriff's inquiry, a signed witness statement and testimony from Farley Dobbs, it will hold considerably more." Something shifted in Silas's face. The reasonableness cracked, not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories where villains reveal themselves completely. Just a hairline fracture visible for 1 second before the surface closed over it again. He knew about the 7 files. He knew about Amos. But Farley Dobbs, she watched that name land, and she knew from the way his face moved that Farley Dobbs was the name he hadn't known to contain. "Farley Dobbs," he said. "His original loan document contradicts the amended version in your county file," she said. "So does his correspondence from Whitfield's office. He kept everything." She kept her voice level and her eyes on his face. "He's not the only one. I haven't had time yet to speak with the others, but I will." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "The probate order stands," he said. "Regardless of anything else. You have until Saturday noon. I know." She looked back at him without flinching. "I'll be at the church at 10 o'clock." He put his hat back on, turned and rode out. His 4 men followed. She stood in the yard until the dust settled. Around her she could hear the sounds of the ranch coming to life. Pete at the water pump, Danny moving horses in the near paddock, the particular creak of the barn door that she'd been meaning to oil for a month. "He's scared," Rhett said quietly from beside her. "Yes, scared men do things they haven't planned." "I know." She turned toward the house. "That's why we're going to the church early." The morning was consumed with preparation. Not the kind of preparation associated with weddings in women's magazines, the kind about flowers and dresses and ceremony, but the harder, practical kind. She filed the marriage agreement at the county recorder's office at 8 o'clock, stamped and witnessed by Prescott, who had apparently decided in the last 2 days that his professional integrity was worth more than his job security. She filed the formal estate challenge with the sheriff's office, attaching every certified copy she'd gathered. She sent a telegram to the territorial judge's office, not expecting an immediate response, but establishing a record that the challenge had been filed before the deadline. She wore her good dress. It was practical dark blue sturdy fabric, not elaborate, and she wore her hair the way she always wore it when she needed to mean business. Martha pressed the dress that morning without being asked the way Martha did things she considered essential. Rhett came from the bunkhouse in a clean shirt she hadn't seen before. Dark, well-fitted, the kind of shirt a man keeps for occasions. He had shaved. He looked, she thought, very much like a man who understood the gravity of what he was about to do and was not performing it lightly. They rode to the church in the wagon. The 4 of them. Josie, Rhett, Martha, and Amos Reed, who had asked to be present, and whose request Josie had granted without hesitation. Behind the wagon, Pete and Buster and Danny rode together because Josie had told them they didn't have to come, and they had come anyway. The church was a small plain building on Mesa Verde's eastern edge, and Reverend Hartley was waiting on the steps when they pulled up. He was 70 years old and had married half the county and buried the other half, and he looked at Josie with the calm affection of a man who had known her since she was a child. He also looked at the man standing in front of the church door, and his expression changed. Silas Vane was there. He had another court order, a second one newer, that he must have had a county official produce within the last 12 hours. He was flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize, and he held the order in front of him with the particular authority of someone who believes that paper is always the final argument. Miss Langford. He didn't move from the doorway. This order requires a postponement of any marriage proceeding until the probate matter is reviewed by the county court. The small crowd that had gathered, because in small towns nothing this dramatic goes unwatched, went very quiet. Josie stepped down from the wagon. She walked to the church steps and stopped 6 feet from Silas. The county court, she said, does not have jurisdiction over a marriage ceremony. That is a matter of church and territorial record, not county probate. The underlying property claim is a separate matter filed this morning with the sheriff's office. She met his eyes. The marriage does not settle the property claim. The property claim will be settled in court regardless of what happens in the next hour. She paused. Which you know. Which means this order is not about the property at all. It's about preventing the ceremony so the fraudulent deadline can be enforced. She said it in front of everyone. Clearly. The word fraudulent in public with her eyes on his face. Behind her she heard people shift. She heard a voice, one she didn't immediately recognize, say something low and affirming. Silas's jaw tightened. I am operating within the legal framework of this county. You are operating within the legal framework you constructed, she said, using 2 dead lawyers and a false power of attorney and a deputy who set fire to my hay shed and then ran when we found the evidence. She turned to the crowd and let her voice carry. Farley Dobbs lost his ranch to this man. I want to know how many others in this county have papers at home that don't match what's in the county files. Because I have seen 7 estate files and every one of them tells the same story. The silence that followed was not passive. It was charged, the particular silence of people who have been holding something and are suddenly aware that they might not have to hold it alone. Silas moved toward her. One of his men put a hand on his arm, which told her something important about how close Silas was to the edge of his own control. And then Rhett stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He took out the marriage agreement, the one surrendering every possible claim to Josie's property, and he handed it to the nearest person standing in the crowd. A woman Josie recognized as the wife of the hardware store owner. Read it, Rhett said. Read it aloud if you're willing. The woman looked at the paper. She looked at her husband. She read it aloud, haltingly at first, then steadily, the plain legal language of a man giving up everything Silas had accused him of wanting. When she finished, the crowd was even quieter than before. Silas's argument that Rhett was a drifter marrying Josie to acquire her land had just been read aloud by a third party, a neutral person in front of the entire town. And it was empty. Silas looked at Josie. She looked at him. "Move away from the door," she said. He didn't move. Reverend Hartley cleared his throat. "Mr. Vane," he said mildly, with the authority of a man who has been arbitrating human conflict for 50 years and is not impressed by court orders. "The second order you've presented is a county probate matter. It does not supersede the territorial right of two consenting adults to solemnize a marriage. I've reviewed this question, and I am prepared to conduct this ceremony." He looked at Silas over his reading glasses. "I'd ask you to step aside." Silas stood for one more long moment. Then he stepped aside. Josie walked up the church steps. Rhett walked beside her. Behind them came Martha and Amos and the hands from Sunridge and half the town of Mesa Verde, crowding into the small church with the particular energy of a community that has just watched something important happen in public and intends to witness the rest of it. They stood before Reverend Hartley, and the morning light came through the church windows the way it always did, honest and flat and without ceremony. And Josie looked at the man standing beside her. He was looking back at her. Not at the crowd, not at the preacher, not at the legal documentation in her saddlebag. At her. She thought about 5 days ago when she had stood in a branding corral at sunrise and read a court order that was supposed to end everything she'd built. She thought about the ledger her father had kept. She thought about Amos Reed and Farley Dobbs, and the 7 estate files, and the smoking ruin of her hay shed, and the 2 hours on horseback when she had told herself she was thinking about the court case and known she was lying. Reverend Hartley began to speak, and she listened to every word which she had not been entirely sure she would given everything she had to think about. But she listened, and the words were the ordinary words, the ones worn smooth by 1,000 ceremonies before this one, and they felt under these particular circumstances completely new. When it came to the vows, she said them clearly. No hesitation. He said his the same way. Reverend Hartley pronounced them married at 18 minutes before noon. Through the open church door, she could see Silas Vane's back as he walked to his horse. She could see, too, that he was not alone in the street, that 2 other men were standing near his horses, and that one of those men who was not one of Silas's hired riders was watching the proceedings with a kind of careful official attention. She didn't know who he was yet. She would find out within the hour, and when she did, everything was going to change again, but not in the direction Silas had intended. Martha pressed something into her hand as they came out of the church. A small battered family Bible, old its spine repaired with glue and wrapped leather, the cover warped from years of being stored somewhere imperfect. "Your father gave me this to keep," Martha said. Her voice was steady and quiet. 3 weeks before he died, he told me the cover was damaged. He told me to hold on to it until it mattered. Josie looked at the Bible. She looked at the cover. The warping was not uniform. It was the particular warping of something stored inside a rigid cover, of something hidden within the binding. Her hands were very still. She looked up at Martha. "He knew," she said. "He knew," Martha agreed. "He couldn't stop them from taking the will from the lawyer's office, but he couldn't let it go without a copy, and he trusted." Martha paused, and for the first time in the entire week, her voice wavered slightly. "He trusted that I would know when to bring it out." Josie looked at the Bible. Inside its damaged cover, she could feel the edges of paper folded, protected, preserved. Her father's original will. The church was still full of people. Silas Vane was still on the street. The 2 men she didn't recognize were still watching. She was married legally properly in front of witnesses to a man she had known for 5 days and trusted for 4. She opened the Bible. The will was 4 pages handwritten in her father's careful script with Whitfield's notary seal pressed into the lower corner of the final page. Josie read it standing in the church doorway with the morning light on the paper and the crowd still pressing around her, and every word was exactly what she had known it would be, what she had believed with absolute certainty, even when she couldn't prove it. Sunridge Ranch in its entirety, to Josephine May Langford. No conditions. No marriage clause. No transfer to any creditor under any circumstances. Her name. Her ranch. Her father's handwriting. She read it twice the way she read everything important, and then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands, and stood very still for a moment, because the alternative was falling apart in front of 60 people, which she was not going to do. Martha put a hand on her arm. Just briefly. Just enough. Josie straightened and walked down the church steps. Silas Vane was still at his horse, one foot in the stirrup, preparing to leave with whatever remained of his dignity. He heard her coming and turned. She held the will out so he could see it without being close enough to touch it. His face went through several things in rapid succession. She watched all of them. Recognition came first. He knew what it was immediately, which told her he had known the original existed and had believed it was safely buried. Then calculation. Then for one honest second, something that might have been fear. Then the surface closed again. "Where did you get that?" he said. It came out flat, not as a question. "My father gave it to someone he trusted," she said. 3 weeks before he died, when he realized his legal papers were being interfered with. She kept her voice even and clear and loud enough for the people standing within 30 feet to hear every word. "This is the original will with Arnold Whitfield's seal and my father's signature dated 14 months ago. It leaves Sunridge Ranch to me without conditions. No marriage clause, no creditor transfer, nothing." The crowd was very quiet. One of the two men she'd noticed earlier, the ones she hadn't recognized, stepped forward. He was perhaps 50, solidly built, wearing a good coat that had nothing of the frontier about it. He had the contained, authoritative manner of a man who spent most of his time in rooms where decisions were made. "Miss Langford," he said, then corrected himself. "Mrs. Calloway. My name is Thomas Reeve. I'm a special investigator with the New Mexico Territorial Court, traveling with Judge Alderman's office." He reached into his coat and produced a document of his own. "We received a telegram 2 days ago regarding possible fraud in the county probate system. Your name was mentioned." She looked at the telegram reference. The date. 2 days ago. She had sent her telegram to the territorial judge's office yesterday morning. Someone else had sent one before her. "Who filed the initial report?" she asked. Reeve looked at her steadily. "The telegram was sent from the Mesa Verde County Recorder's office." He paused. "A clerk named Prescott." The name landed like a stone in still water. Young Prescott, with his nervous hands and his too careful face, who had watched Silas Vane walk through his office and tamper with a dead man's files, and who had apparently spent the last 2 days quietly deciding that there were things he could not continue to not do. Josie looked at Reeve. She thought about what she had in her saddlebag in the garden box at Sunridge and Farley Dobbs's canvas sack under his rented bed, and in Amos Reed's written statement, and in the 7 certified estate files from the county records. She thought about the green ledger she had written until 2 in the morning. "Mr. Reeve," she said, "I have documentation I'd like you to review." Silas moved then. Not toward her, toward his horse, with the sudden decisive motion of a man who has made a calculation and arrived at the conclusion that being somewhere else is the correct answer. Rhett was faster. He was not violent about it. He stepped to the left of Silas's horse and took the bridle with one hand, not roughly, but with the absolute certainty of a man who has handled livestock and knows that controlled steady pressure is more effective than force. The horse stopped. Silas, 1 foot still in the stirrup, had no graceful option. "Mr. Vane," Reeve said from behind Josie, "I'd appreciate if you'd stay in town for the morning." Silas came down off the horse. His face was composed again. He was very good at composed, but his eyes moved between Reeve and the will in Josie's hand, and Rhett holding his horse's bridle, and she could see him calculating which of these problems was most urgent, and finding that they were all equally bad. "I am happy to cooperate with any legitimate inquiry," he said. "Good," Reeve said. "Let's start at the sheriff's office." The morning reorganized itself. Pruitt's office became the center of it. Reeve and his associate at the desk. Josie, laying out documents in the order she had planned them the night she couldn't sleep. Rhett beside her following the sequence without needing instruction, because he had been there when she built it. Silas sat in the corner chair with a man she assumed was his lawyer, who had arrived from somewhere with impressive speed, and who was now reading through everything with the rapid, focused attention of someone trying to identify which problems were survivable and which weren't. She watched the lawyer's face as he read. She watched the moment she could identify it precisely, the slight change in his jaw when he understood that the shipping manifest was not an isolated document, but part of a pattern that ran through 7 estate files and 2 witness statements and a sheriff's inquiry and a signed statement from Amos Reed. He leaned close to Silas and said something, very quietly. Silas's expression did not change, but he stopped talking. Reeve worked through the documents methodically, asking questions that were precise and non-leading the questions of someone who already knows what he's looking at and is building the formal record. He asked Josie about the freight records her father had kept. He asked about the power of attorney and the timeline of her father's illness. He asked about Whitfield's death. At the mention of Whitfield, Silas's lawyer said, "My client has no comment on matters related to Arnold Whitfield's estate." The room went very still. No one had asked about Whitfield's estate. The question had been about Whitfield's death. Reeve looked at the lawyer for a moment. Then he made a note. Pruitt, who had been watching from behind his desk with the expression of a man who has been confirmed in something he'd suspected for years and is taking no visible pleasure in being right, said Mr. Reeve. "The deputy I mentioned in my initial report, Carl Hale. He left county employment the morning after the fire. We've had no contact." "We'll find him," Reeve said without looking up from his notes. The certainty with which he said it flat, practical entirely without drama, was more frightening than any threat would have been. Josie saw Silas register it. His hands resting on his knees moved slightly, adjusted. She thought about Hale, and where a man runs when he's been paid to do something he can no longer deny. She thought about the fact that Silas had sent him away, had told him to leave before the full scope of the investigation was visible. A man who sends away his own tools before they become liabilities is a man who is more interested in his own survival than anyone else's. Hale would figure that out eventually. And when he did, he would have a decision to make about his own situation. She filed that thought and moved on. Amos Reed came in at 11 o'clock. He had dressed carefully in the plain, dignified way of an old man who understands that how you present yourself in a serious moment is part of what you're saying. He sat across from Reeve and answered questions for 40 minutes without hedging or softening anything. He had already written it down. Now he said it aloud, and the saying of it had a quality she hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, but the particular settling of a man who has carried a weight for a long time and is finally putting it down in the right place. When he described Silas Vane at the Santa Fe land sale the moment of recognition, the face he had been afraid of for 3 years, he looked directly at Silas as he said it. Silas looked at the wall. Farley Dobbs came at 11:30. He brought his canvas sack. He sat in the same chair Amos had used and placed his documents on the table one by one with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been waiting 2 years to do this and intends to do it completely. The original loan document. The letters from Whitfield's office. The cattle bill of sale that had never been credited. Reeve compared Farley's original loan document to the amended version in the certified county file. He put them side by side and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Silas. Silas's lawyer put his hand on his client's arm. "On the advice of counsel," the lawyer said, "my client will not be making statements at this time." Reeve nodded as though this was expected. "We'll be in touch." It was past noon when they came out of the sheriff's office. The noon deadline had passed, but the deadline no longer mattered because the original will was in Reeve's official custody, and a territorial court investigator did not leave town without a conclusion. The street was quiet in the midday heat. Rhett was beside her, and Martha and Amos were behind them, and Farley Dobbs stood at the edge of the group with his canvas sack over his shoulder, looking at the street with an expression she recognized from the mirror. The particular look of someone who has just done something that cost them and hasn't yet processed whether the cost was worth it. She walked over to him. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "Did it help?" "Yes." He nodded once, the small economical nod of a man who doesn't traffic in unnecessary expression. Then he turned and walked back toward the feed store, and she let him go, because some things need space to settle before they can be spoken about. They ate at the lunch counter, Josie and Rhett and Martha and Amos, and it was a strange meal, quiet and enormous. At the same time, the kind of meal where everyone is processing something too large to put into conversation, but the act of eating together is its own statement. Martha ordered pie without being asked and placed a piece in front of each of them. "It's a wedding," she said. "Someone should mark it." Amos picked up his fork with the solemn appreciation of a man who had spent too long eating alone in rented rooms. Rhett looked at Josie across the table, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, which was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of two people who have said what needed saying and are resting. She got back to Sunridge by mid-afternoon. The ranch looked the same. The ruined hay shed was still there, its charred frame standing against the sky like an unfinished argument. The barn was intact. The cattle were in the north pasture. The water trough was clean and full. She stood in the yard and looked at all of it, and felt for the first time since Monday morning that it was not about to be taken from her. The feeling was not triumphant. It was quieter than that. Something like the way a body feels when a fever breaks. Not celebration, but relief. So deep it becomes almost physical, a loosening of everything that had been braced. Pete came out of the barn and looked at her face and said without preamble, "It worked." "It's working," she said. "It's not finished." "But it's working." "Yes." He went back into the barn. She went into the house. Martha had come home before them and had the kitchen organized and dinner already beginning, because Martha responded to crisis by feeding people and responded to resolution by feeding them better. The smell of it, something slow cooked and real, was one of the most ordinary and welcome things Josie could remember. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about everything that still needed to happen. The territorial court inquiry was open. Reeve would be in county for at least a week, possibly longer. The original will was in evidence. The 7 estate files were in evidence. Amos's statement. Farley's documents, the shipping manifest, the fraudulent power of attorney, Prescott's notes, all in evidence. Silas Vane was still for the moment a free man. A quiet man. A man whose lawyer had told him to stop talking, which was the beginning of the end for people like him, but not the end itself. There was still work to do. And there was something else. She and Rhett had been married for 5 hours. They had not had a single moment alone since the ceremony. This was not something she was complaining about. The morning had been what it needed to be, but it was a fact that sat in the back of her mind with a particular weight that she couldn't entirely ignore. He came in from outside when she was still sitting at the table, hat in his hand, and looked at her with the particular look she had come to associate with him, thinking something he wasn't sure yet how to say. She waited. "The bunkhouse," he said. "Yes. I've been sleeping in the bunkhouse." "I know." "That can continue," he said. "Whatever you need. We made an agreement, and the terms are the terms." She looked at him for a moment. He was being careful. He was being so careful in the way of someone who has promised a thing and intends to honor it regardless of what he wants, that she could see the effort it took. She recognized the effort because she'd been making it herself. "Rhett," she said. "Come sit down." He sat. She looked at the table for a moment, then at him. "I need to tell you something I should have said earlier," she said. "Or maybe there hasn't been time to say it until now. I'm not sure which." She paused. "When I showed you the court order in the yard Monday afternoon when we'd just met, I didn't show it to you because I'd decided to trust you. I showed it to you because I was tired and out of options, and you'd just handled my bull problem without being asked, and something in me just—" She stopped. "I've been making decisions based on evidence all week. Evidence about the will, about the documents, about Silas. I've been watching you the same way, building a case. And," he said. "The case is solid," she said. He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. It was not triumph, and it was not relief. And it was not the particular warmth of romantic feeling, though it contained elements of all three. It was something more specific, the look of a man who has been misjudged for so long that being accurately seen is its own kind of experience. "I'm not going to pretend this is simple," she said. "We've known each other 6 days. We got married in the middle of a fraud investigation. The next several months are going to involve a territorial court case, and rebuilding a hay shed, and probably depositions and testimony, and—" "Josie," he said. She stopped. "I know all of that," he said. "I was there for all of it. I'm trying to say, I know what you're trying to say." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and his voice dropped to the register. It went to when he was being most honest. You're trying to say that you feel something and you don't want to feel it carelessly. That you've spent 6 days making decisions about survival, and this one is different. That you're not sure what to do with a feeling that doesn't have a document attached to it. She looked at him. That's exactly what I'm saying, she said. Then here's what I'd suggest, he said. We finish what we started. The court case, the inquiry, the testimony. We do the work. And while we're doing it, we don't pretend the way we agreed about what's underneath the work. He held her eyes. We already said we'd tell each other the truth. That applies to this too. She thought about it. She thought about it the way she thought about everything from all sides, with the evidence laid out, without letting what she wanted to be true interfere with what was actually there. What was actually? There was a man who had ridden into her gate on an exhausted horse, and in 6 days had fixed her fence. Identified a poisoning, found 3 years of missing evidence, defended her in front of a crowd, held a horse's bridle so a fraudulent land grabber couldn't flee, and kept every single promise he had made to her. What was actually there was that she trusted him. Not blindly, not carelessly. With her eyes fully open, having watched him under conditions that revealed character faster than years of ordinary acquaintance. What was actually there was that. This had stopped being about survival. Somewhere around the 2nd day, and she had been too busy surviving to properly acknowledge it until now. All right, she said. He nodded. Martha came in from the garden with herbs in her hand and looked at the two of them at the kitchen table and looked back at her herbs and said nothing, which meant she had seen what was between them and judged it satisfactory. The following days moved in a different rhythm, not easier. The inquiry generated more work, not less. Reeve wanted testimony organized and cross-referenced. Josie spent hours at the table with her ledger and the certified copies, building the kind of layered case that would survive a courtroom challenge from a skilled defense lawyer. Rhett worked the ranch in the mornings and sat with her in the evenings, reviewing documents and asking questions that were useful. Not deferring to her judgment, engaging with it. Pushing back when he saw something she'd missed. He pushed back once significantly about Whitfield. We can't introduce the question of how Whitfield died, he said. Not without proof. If we put it in the case and Silas's lawyer can show we have no evidence, he'll use it to make everything else look like speculation. She'd been thinking the same thing and not wanting to let it go. I know, she said. Reeve is good at his job, Rhett said. He noticed the lawyer's reaction when Whitfield's estate came up. He'll pursue it without us directing him. And if he doesn't find anything, then we don't have it. He met her eyes. A solid case with a missing piece is still a solid case. A case that overreaches and gets caught speculating is a much harder thing to recover. She looked at the ledger. She thought about her father, bent over his accounts in the last months of his life, building something he didn't have time to finish. She thought about the way he had always told her, present what you know. Let what you know speak for itself. You're right, she said. He blinked. You agree. Should I not? You've disagreed with me at least 7 times this week. I'd started to count on it. I disagree when you're wrong, she said. You're not wrong about this. He looked at her for a moment, with what she was fairly sure was affection. Though it was expressed in the understated economical way he expressed most things. I might write that down, he said. So there's documentation. She threw her pencil at him. He caught it. Martha, passing through the kitchen, did not acknowledge this exchange, but she was smiling when she turned to the stove. The crisis came on the 3rd morning after the wedding. She was at the desk working through Farley Dobbs's correspondence. He had brought additional letters that had surfaced from a box in his rented room when Danny Reyes appeared at the back door with the specific look of a young man delivering news he'd run with. Deputy Hale's back, Danny said. She looked up. He came into the sheriff's office this morning, Danny continued. He wants to talk to Reeve. She was on her feet before he'd finished. She found Rhett in the barn. She told him in 4 sentences. He was already unhitching the horse he'd been working with. If Hale is turning himself into Reeve, Rhett said, it means he's decided that talking is safer than running, which means he knows something that's worth trading. Silas has cut him loose, she said. That's what that means. Hale ran because Silas told him to protect Silas. And now Hale has realized that Silas protecting himself doesn't include protecting Hale. And a man who's been thrown away by the man he worked for, Rhett said, tends to be very willing to talk about what he knows. They rode to town. Pruitt's office was deliberately calm when they arrived, the way a room becomes when everyone in it is aware that something significant is happening and is trying not to disturb the conditions. Reeve was at the desk. Carl Hale sat across from him, a man in his mid-30s, lean and weathered, who had the look of someone who hadn't slept since he'd ridden out. His hat was on the floor beside his chair. He looked at Josie when she came in, and then quickly away. Reeve looked at her. "Mrs. Calloway, Deputy Hale was just explaining some things." She sat. Rhett took a position near the wall where he could see both doors. This was not something they discussed. He simply did it the same way she had simply understood why he was doing it. Hale talked for 2 hours. He had been on Silas's payroll in addition to his deputy's salary for 22 months. His primary function had been monitoring reporting on landowners whose properties Silas was interested in watching for financial vulnerabilities and occasionally facilitating access to county records after hours. The Langford account had come to his attention 8 months before Hector Langford died, when Silas identified the freight records as a problem that needed containment. "He knew your father was keeping records," Hale said, not looking at Josie. "He told me that Hector Langford was the type to document things, that if he documented too much, it would be a problem down the line." "What did you do?" Reeve asked. "Nothing about the records. Silas said he'd handle that through Whitfield." Hale paused. "What I did was watch the property, and report when Miss Langford made trips to town, and tell Silas when she started investigating." He looked at his hands. "I told him the morning after she went to the records office the first time. That's why he went himself the next morning, to move the correspondence." "And the fire," Reeve said. "Silas didn't tell me to set a fire," Hale said. "It came out fast with the particular speed of a man protecting the edges of his culpability. He told me to accelerate, his word. He wanted the situation resolved before the court could get involved. He stopped. "I made the decision about the shed myself. I knew. But I thought—" He looked at the floor. "I thought it would be enough to frighten her into giving up." The room was very still. Josie looked at Carl Hale, this man who had watched her property and reported her movements and burned her hay shed and run when the evidence closed in, and she felt several things simultaneously. Rage was in there. So was something closer to sadness. He was not a monster. He was a man of middling character who had made a series of accommodating decisions until the accommodations had accumulated into something he couldn't undo. The world was full of Carl Hales. They were more responsible for what happened to people like her and Farley Dobbs and Amos Reed than the Silas Vanes were in some ways, because there were more of them and they were easier to miss. "What about Whitfield?" Reeve asked. Hale went still. "I don't know anything about Whitfield," he said, too quickly. "Deputy Hale, I don't know anything about Whitfield's death," he said. The emphasis on death was its own kind of answer. "I know that Silas met with him 3 times in the 6 months before he died. I know that after the last meeting, Whitfield went to find Silas's lawyer and then came back to his office and locked the door and didn't come out until the next morning. And I know that 2 weeks later, he was dead." Hale looked at Reeve directly. "I don't know what happened between Silas and Whitfield. I am telling you that I have reasons not to want to know, and that I have carried those reasons for 8 months. The room was so quiet that Josie could hear the street outside a horse. Someone's voice, the ordinary sounds of a town going about its day. Reeve wrote for a long time without speaking. Then he said to Pruitt, "I'm going to need the territorial court-martial in this county by end of week." Pruitt nodded. Hale was placed in this county jail, not in Pruitt's cells, which Silas had too long an association with, but in a room in the courthouse that Reeve's associate secured with a lock from his own kit. Hale did not object. Hale, Josie thought, was relieved. She and Rhett rode home in the afternoon with the particular heavy quiet of people who have witnessed something that requires processing. "He'll testify," Rhett said after a while. "Yes. Against Silas." Everything he said in that room, Reeve will formalize it. Put it in writing. And Hale knows that talking is his only leverage now. Rhett rode for a moment without speaking. Then, Whitfield. Yes, she said. Reeve is going to open that. He has to. She looked at the road. Silas did something to Whitfield. Or someone did on his behalf. Hale knows it and won't say it, which means he's still afraid of it, which means it's the piece of this that goes deeper than fraud. She paused. My father kept those freight records. He was building a case against a man who was capable of... She stopped. Of doing what was done to Whitfield, Rhett said. Yes, they rode in silence for a while. The afternoon was cooling the way New Mexico afternoons do, fast and complete, the heat going out of the air, like a decision reversing itself. He knew he was in danger, she said. It wasn't a question. My father. He knew what Silas was what he was capable of. And he kept documenting anyway. She felt the weight of that, the particular courage of a sick man with a ledger, doing what he could with what he had left. He didn't confront Silas. He built the case and hid the will and gave the Bible to Martha, and trusted that someone would find the right moment. He was trusting you, Rhett said. She looked at him. He raised you, Rhett said simply. He knew what you'd do. She didn't answer for a moment. The ranch came into view over the last ridge, the house, the barn, the ruined shed frame, the cattle moving in the evening light. I'm going to rebuild the hay shed before winter, she said. I know. I'll need help with the framing. I'll do the framing, he said. You can supervise and tell me when it's not right. I'm certain I'll have notes. I'm certain you will. There was something in his voice that she recognized now, the dry warmth of a person who has stopped being careful about letting the warmth show. I've come to rely on your notes. She looked at him sideways. I was watching the road with the expression he wore when he thought no one was looking at him. Not the contained, careful face he showed the world, but the quieter version underneath it. The version that had been there, she thought all along, waiting for conditions it could trust. She had spent 6 days evaluating conditions. She had reached a conclusion. Rhett, she said. He looked at her. When this is over, she said. When the inquiry is closed and the court case is concluded and Silas Vane has been dealt with. She paused, choosing words with the precision she applied to legal documents. I don't want you to go. He looked at her for a long moment. The horse moved steadily beneath her. I wasn't planning to, he said. I know you weren't planning to. I'm saying I don't want you to. There's a difference. I understood the difference. She could see that he understood it, that she was not describing an arrangement, or a convenience, or even a partnership. Though it was all of those things. She was saying something that had no document attached to it. Then I won't, he said. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was quieter than that, the particular quiet of a promise made by someone who has learned to make only the promises they can keep. She nodded. She looked at the road. Inside her chest, something that had been held at careful distance for 6 days, finally came the rest of the way in. They came through the gate at Sunridge as the last light left the sky, and the yard was lit with the lamp from the kitchen window, and Martha was on the porch with coffee she'd been keeping warm because Martha always knew when they were coming home, and always had something ready. Pete came out of the barn and looked at their faces and went back inside with the satisfied expression of a man whose assessment of a situation has been confirmed. Josie dismounted and stood with her hand on her horse's neck for a moment, looking at the ranch. Her ranch. Still standing still. Hers, still the place her father had built, and her name was on, and no one had managed to take. Rhett came to stand beside her. There's still the court case, she said. There is. And the hay shed. Yes. And the water rights documentation that needs updating. I can look at that tomorrow. And the northern fence line needs... Josie. His voice was gentle. She stopped. It'll keep, he said. Tonight, it'll keep. She looked at the lamp in the kitchen window. She looked at Martha on the porch. She thought about her father's ledger and the green book she'd filled at 2 a.m, and the Bible with the will in its cover, and all the documents and evidence and careful work of the last 6 days. She thought about a man riding through her open gate on an exhausted horse on a Monday afternoon, and everything that had followed from that one moment of showing a stranger a piece of paper she hadn't meant to show anyone. "Yes," she said, "tonight it'll keep." She walked toward the porch, and he walked beside her, and Martha handed them each a cup without ceremony, and the kitchen light spilled warm onto the yard. The territorial court-martial arrived on Thursday. He came with 2 deputies and a sealed order from Judge Alderman's bench, and the first thing he did after reading in at the sheriff's office was ask to see the complete evidence file that Reeve had assembled. He spent 4 hours with it. Josie knew this because Reeve told her afterward, and because she had spent those same 4 hours at her kitchen table going through the water rights documentation Rhett had flagged, trying to occupy her hands, while her mind ran ahead to outcomes she couldn't yet control. Rhett came in at noon, read her face, and poured 2 cups of coffee without comment. "He's going to charge Silas," she said. It wasn't a question. "Reeve thinks so. The Hale testimony alone is enough for the arson charge. The estate files cover fraud and conspiracy. The shipping manifest handles the cattle theft." He sat across from her. "The Whitfield question is separate." "Reeve hasn't closed it." "No. He sent 2 men to Santa Fe to review Whitfield's death record and speak to his physician." Rhett held his cup with both hands. "That will take time. Longer than this week." She knew that. She had accepted it mostly because her father had taught her the difference between what you could finish and what you had to start and trust someone else to continue. She had started it. Reeve would continue it. "The other ranchers," she said. "I spoke to 2 more yesterday. A man named Caswell, who lost his place on the western boundary 18 months ago, and a widow named Esther Prout. She's been living with her daughter in town since her ranch transferred. Both of them have original documents that contradict the county file." She looked at him. "You went to find them without telling me." "You were preparing the water rights file. It needed doing." He met her eyes steadily. "I wasn't hiding it. I was managing time." She considered the distinction. It was a fair one. "Next time, tell me what you're doing," she said. "Even if it's efficient." "Agreed." He paused. "Caswell wants to come forward. Esther Prout needs another day to decide. She's been afraid for a year and a half." "I'll go see her." "I thought you might." Esther Prout was 71 years old and lived in 2 rooms above her daughter's dry goods store, and she received Josie in a sitting room that was very small and very neat, with the particular neatness of a woman who has lost a large space and has organized a small one with great care. She had silver hair and careful hands and eyes that had the look of someone who has been watching for danger for so long that wariness had become the resting state of her face. She offered tea. Josie accepted it because refusing would have been a statement about urgency that the moment didn't need. They talked for an hour. Josie did not begin with the evidence or the court case or what Esther could contribute. She began with the ranch, what it had been called, how long the Prout family had worked it, what Esther had grown there. She listened. She asked questions. She let the woman talk about what she had lost before she asked her to revisit how she had lost it. When the time came, she laid out what she had found in the county files, gently, without drama, in the language of facts, rather than accusation. Esther listened with her teacup held in both hands and her eyes on the middle distance. "He took everything," she said when Josie finished. "My husband was sick. I didn't understand the documents. I trusted the lawyer Whitfield because everyone said he was honest." She paused. "Afterward, I went back to Whitfield. I told him what had happened to the loan terms, that the numbers weren't what we'd agreed to. He looked at me and he said..." She stopped, set down the cup. "He said he was sorry. Just that. He was sorry. And I could see on his face that he meant it." Josie was quiet. "He knew," Esther said. "He knew what Silas had done, and he couldn't undo it, and it was eating him alive." She looked at her hands. 2 months later, he was dead. The room was very still. "Mrs. Prout," Josie said carefully, "did Whitfield ever say anything else to you about what had happened, or about Silas?" Esther looked at her for a long moment. "He wrote me a letter," she said. Josie kept her face completely still. "After I came to see him. He sent it to my daughter's address, not mine, because I think he was afraid it could be intercepted." Esther stood and went to a small chest in the corner of the room. She opened it and took out an envelope that had been handled many times, its edges worn soft. "I've kept it because I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't think anyone would believe me." She held it out. Josie took it. She did not open it in Esther Prout's sitting room. She thanked her, promised her that her name would be protected as long as possible, and told her that the territorial court investigator would want to speak with her when she was ready. "I'm ready," Esther said. She said it with the flatness of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has decided that the fear has cost more than the courage will. Josie rode back to Sunridge with the letter in her coat pocket, and her mind working at a speed that made the 8 miles feel like 2. She found Rhett at the barn. She held out the letter. He read the outside of the envelope. He looked at her. "From Whitfield," she said. He went very still. She opened it at the kitchen table with Martha present, because Martha had been part of this from the beginning, and she was not going to exclude her now. The letter was 2 pages. Whitfield's handwriting, she recognized it from the notary's seal on the original will, was less steady than it had been on official documents. The letter had been written by a man in distress. He wrote that he had been coerced, that Silas Vane had come to him 4 years earlier with documentation suggesting that Whitfield had falsified records in a previous county. Records that Whitfield wrote had in fact been falsified by a clerk he had employed and trusted and had not properly supervised. The falsification was real. His culpability was indirect but genuine. Silas had held this over him. He had altered documents for Silas when told to. He had witnessed signatures that he knew were obtained under duress. He had watched what happened to Esther Prout and Farley Dobbs and the others, and had told himself each time that it was better than the alternative, his own exposure, his own ruin. He wrote that he had finally refused, that he had told Silas at their last meeting that he would not alter the Langford will, that he had a copy of the original in his own safe, and he intended to provide it to Hector Langford's family when the time came. 3 weeks later, he had been dead. He did not know what Silas would do when he refused. He wrote that he was afraid. He wrote that he was sending the letter because if something happened to him, he wanted there to be a record that was not in Silas Vane's reach. He wrote that he was sorry, the same word Esther had heard him say aloud, and that sorry was insufficient, but it was what he had. The kitchen was completely silent when Josie finished reading. Martha was the first to speak. "He had the copy of the will," she said. "He told Silas he had it. Silas couldn't let him live long enough to use it." "No," Josie said. "This is the Whitfield piece," Rhett said. His voice was quiet and very controlled. "Reeve has been looking for this." "I know." She was at the sheriff's office within the hour. Reeve read the letter twice without speaking. He read it a third time. Then he set it down on the desk with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something they understand to be significant. "Where did this come from?" he asked. She told him about Esther Prout, about the visit, the tea, the conversation about what had been lost. She watched Reeve's face as she spoke and saw the expression of a man who has been building a case and has just been handed the piece that completes the architecture. "This establishes coercion," he said, "which explains the altered documents without requiring us to prove Whitfield acted out of simple dishonesty." He looked at her. "And the statement about refusing about having the will establishes motive," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Calloway, what you have done this week, the documentation, the witnesses, the records, this is not the work of someone who was simply defending her property." "My father started it," she said. "I finished what he couldn't." Reeve looked at her steadily. "We're going to open a formal murder inquiry into Arnold Whitfield's death." The words were very plain and very large. She had known it was coming, had known since the moment she'd read the letter what it meant. But hearing it stated in an official voice in an official room made it something different from a conclusion she'd reached privately. It made it real in the way that only spoken things become real. "Will you get him?" she asked. Reeve picked up the letter. "We'll build the case properly. It will take time. But yes." He met her eyes. "We'll get him." The arrest came the following morning. Silas Vane was taken from his house at 7 o'clock by the territorial marshal and 2 deputies on charges of fraud, conspiracy, arson, theft, and coercion. The murder inquiry was listed separately pending the Santa Fe investigation, which meant that charge was not yet on the formal warrant. But Reeve had told Silas's lawyer the previous evening that it was coming, and the lawyer had arrived at the marshal's office at 6 that morning, looking like a man who had not slept and was beginning to understand the full dimensions of the situation he was in. Josie was not present for the arrest. She knew it was happening. Reeve had told her the evening before out of courtesy, and because he felt she had earned the information, but she chose to be at Sunridge instead. At the barn, working. She was treating the mare's tender hoof when Rhett came in and said, "It's done." She set down the hoof and straightened up. "Buster just rode back from town," Rhett said. "The marshal took him from the house. He didn't resist." She nodded. She had expected that. A man like Silas Vane understood when the arithmetic had changed. He would fight in courtrooms through lawyers for as long as the system allowed, but he would not make a scene in front of his house on a Friday morning. "The county commissioner position," she asked. "Suspended pending inquiry." The other 2 commissioners voted for it this morning. Apparently Reeve had a conversation with them yesterday. She thought about that, the other 2 commissioners' men who had worked alongside Silas for years voting to suspend him within hours of his arrest. Not because they were brave or principled necessarily, because the arithmetic had changed and they could read it. "The land claims," she said. "Frozen." Reeve filed the freeze order this morning. "Every ranch Silas acquired in the past 8 years is under court review." She let that settle. 7 ranches. 7 families who had lost something and might get it back or get compensation for it, or at least get the acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong and had been seen. Esther Prout's 2 rooms above the dry goods store. Farley Dobbs's canvas sack of documents under his rented bed. Amos Reed's 3 years of silence. "I need to tell Farley," she said. "I'll ride with you." They told Farley at the feed store, where he was loading grain again into the same wagon. He listened with his back against the wagon bed and his arms crossed and his face doing the complicated work of a man absorbing news he had wanted for 2 years and doesn't quite trust yet. "The ranch," he said. "Is there a chance?" "The court will review it," Josie said. "I can't promise you what that means yet, but it's being looked at, and you have documentation, and Reeve knows your case." He nodded. He looked at the feed bags in the wagon. He looked at his hands. "My wife's buried on that property," he said. She didn't have anything adequate to say to that, so she said, "I know, I'm sorry." He nodded again. He picked up another bag and heaved it into the wagon bed, because a man with 15 years of farming in him doesn't stop working just because his life has reorganized itself. Work was the thing he knew how to do with feelings that didn't fit anywhere else. She understood that completely. On the way back to Sunridge, she and Rhett rode without talking for a long time. The afternoon was clear, and the mountains to the north were the particular sharp blue that they got in the late summer, and she looked at them the way she always looked at them, as orientation, as home, as the fixed point around which the rest of the world organized itself. "The Grazing Association," she said. Rhett looked at her. Silas had been charging small ranchers a crossing fee to move cattle through his land. 3 of the 7 ranches he acquired blocked the natural routes. She had been thinking about this for days in the spaces between everything else. If those land claims are under review, the routes may open. But even if they don't open immediately, small ranchers in this valley need a way to move cattle without paying someone else's extortion. "A shared association," he said. He was following her thinking without needing the intermediate steps. "Pool the smaller parcels. Create a legal right-of-way. With transparent records, open accounts. Nothing that can be manipulated the way Silas manipulated county files. You'd need someone to manage the records." "I would." She paused. "I'm thinking about who that person might be." He looked at her with what she had come to recognize as the expression he wore when she had said something that landed directly on a thought he'd been having and hadn't yet found words for. "The valley trusts you," he said. "After this week, after what happened in that church and at the courthouse and with Reeve, they know who you are." "I'm not interested in being trusted for my own sake," she said. "I'm interested in making something that doesn't require trust. Something that's transparent enough that trust is beside the point where the records speak for themselves and anyone can check them." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have liked that," he said. She felt the truth of it, the particular warmth of a statement that is accurate in a way that reaches past the words. "Yes," she said. "He would have." 3 weeks later, the territorial court formally confirmed Sunridge Ranch as Josie's property. The ruling was brief and unambiguous. The original will superseded the fraudulent document. In every respect, the marriage clause had no legal validity, and the debt attached to the estate was voided on the grounds of fraudulent modification. Reeves signed the confirmation. The judge's seal went on it. She received it at the county recorder's office from Prescott, who had recently been offered a promotion that he had accepted with the particular surprised gratitude of a young man who had done one brave thing and discovered that bravery has compound interest. She brought it home and put it in the top drawer of her father's desk. Not framed, not displayed. Filed the way he would have filed it, important, accessible, known. The hay shed was rebuilt before the first frost. Rhett did the framing as promised, and she had notes as promised, and they argued for 20 minutes about the angle of the roof pitch, and she was right, and he acknowledged it, and they finished the work in 4 days. Amos Reed worked alongside them because Josie had offered him the permanent foreman position, and he had accepted it with the same gravity with which he'd signed his witness statement, understanding that he was taking on something that carried weight and being willing to carry it. Buster Walsh stayed on. He worked with the particular dedication of a man redeeming himself one day at a time, which was the only way redemption actually worked, and Josie let him do it without referencing what he'd done before, which was the only way she knew to make the redemption real, rather than performative. Danny Reyes asked to learn the account books. She taught him. The Sunridge Grazing Association was formally organized in November, with 3 founding ranches and a membership that doubled by spring. Josie wrote the charter herself, with Rhett reviewing every clause, and the final version was 6 pages of plain language that left no room for the kind of interpretive gap that Silas had exploited for years. She was elected treasurer at the first meeting, not by unanimous acclamation, but by a genuine vote, which was how she wanted it. Farley Dobbs's ranch was returned to him by court order in December. The determination took longer than she'd hoped, but shorter than she'd feared, and when she heard, she rode to tell him herself. He was at the property already, walking the land. He hadn't walked in 2 years. In the particular way a person moves through a place they had given up and been given back. He saw her coming and stopped. She told him, "Just, it's yours again. The court order is filed." He sat down on the ground, right there in the field. A 54-year-old rancher sitting down in his own pasture because his legs had decided that was the right response to the news. She got off her horse and sat beside him because some moments required company, and that was all they required. They sat there for a while. Silas Vane's trial was scheduled for January and then postponed to March as his lawyers filed motions and counter-motions and requests for review that were each individually reasonable and collectively designed to delay as long as the system would allow. The murder inquiry into Whitfield's death was formally opened in February, when the Santa Fe investigators found a physician's private journal that described Whitfield's final consultation symptoms, inconsistent with natural fever concerns. The physician had documented, but not yet acted upon when Whitfield died. The journal had been in the physician's personal files, not the official record. It had not been looked for before, because no one had known to look. Reeves sent Josie a telegram when the murder inquiry opened. She read it at the kitchen table with Rhett across from her, and she held it for a moment before she set it down. "He's going to spend the rest of his life in a courtroom," she said. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular finality of a person who has watched a complicated thing arrive at its necessary conclusion. "Yes," Rhett said. "That's not what I would have chosen for him," she said. He looked at her. "What would you have chosen?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "I would have chosen for none of it to have happened," she said. "For my father to still be alive. For Farley Dobbs to have never lost his ranch. For Esther Prout to still be in her house. For Amos to have testified 3 years ago and cleared your name before it cost you 3 years. She paused. "But given what happened, given what he did, I want accountability. I want the record to be clear. I want there to be something on paper that says this happened and it was wrong and it mattered." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "The record is clear," he said. His name had been cleared in October when the shipping manifest and Amos's testimony were formally reviewed by the territorial court, and the Rosario inquiry was overturned. The notation in the county record now stated that the cattle loss had been the result of deliberate sabotage by a party connected to the purchasing buyer, Silas Vane's company, and that Rhett Calloway had no culpability in the matter. He had held the paper in his hands for a long time when Reeve gave it to him. He hadn't said much. He didn't need to say much for her to understand what it meant: 3 years of a door being closed, and then the door opening, and the light on the other side being ordinary, everyday light. Not dramatic, just light. On their second anniversary, a Saturday in July, 2 years after they had stood in front of Reverend Hartley, Josie found the marriage agreement while reorganizing the top drawer of her father's desk. She'd put it there beside the court confirmation of ownership, and she hadn't looked at it since. She read it through. The plain language of a man surrendering every possible claim written at the county records office on a Thursday afternoon by someone who understood what the document needed to say and said it without embellishment. She took it to where Rhett was on the porch going through the week's association accounts. He looked up. He saw what she was holding. "I found it," she said. He set down the accounts. "Do you want to burn it?" he asked. She read the final clause, the one that said neither party would ever control the other, that both remained free in the fullest legal sense, that the partnership was one of choice rather than compulsion. "No," she said. She folded it and held it in her hand. "That part is still useful." He looked at her with the expression she had come to love, not the contained, careful face he showed the world, but the one underneath it. The one that had been there all along. "You're going to keep it as a reminder," he said. "I'm going to keep it because it's true," she said. "We were free when we made this agreement. We're free now. That's the point." She held his eyes. "The point isn't that we have to stay. The point is that we choose to." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him. And they sat on the porch of Sunridge Ranch in the summer evening, with the cattle in the north pasture and the rebuilt hay shed, standing solid against the sky, and the association accounts spread between them and the marriage agreement in her hand. And there was nothing dramatic about any of it. It was just a life. Her life built on her terms, shared with someone who had never once tried to diminish it. The following morning, she was at the gate when she saw him coming back from the north pasture on his good horse, easy in the saddle, the way he always was, and on a pure impulse, she walked forward and swung the gate shut before he reached it. He pulled up and looked at her. She could see the question in his expression and the amusement beneath it. "You need permission to enter," she called. He dismounted on the left side, the way he always did, and removed his hat and looked at her across the closed gate. "May I come through, Mrs. Calloway?" She opened the gate and took his hand. "You rode through without asking the first time," she said, "and you married me 5 days later. I was under considerable pressure." He walked his horse through the gate and fell into step beside her, and she kept his hand, and the gate swung closed behind them on Sunridge Ranch. Her name on the deed, her father's ledger in the drawer, her own ledger beside it, the record complete and honest and entirely hers. Because a woman who had built everything she owned should never have to surrender it to earn security. Because real love does not arrive through a court order or a deadline or a moment of desperation. It arrives through the daily accumulated choice of two people who see each other clearly and keep choosing anyway. Because freedom is not something you give up when you find someone worth trusting. It is the thing you bring with you whole and intact into every morning you decide to share. Josie Langford had learned that from her father, and from her land, and from a week that had tried to take everything from her, and from a man who had ridden through her gate on a Monday with nothing but an exhausted horse and a ruined name, and the kind of character that holds up when it's tested. She had kept her ranch. She had kept her name. She had kept herself. And she had chosen freely the life that came with all three.